The ad on Craigslist seemed perfect for someone drowning in student loans like me. $400 a month for a room in a house near campus, utilities included, with 3 other roommates to split the common areas. I'd just turned 23 that April, and after burning through most of my savings on textbooks and ramen, this place felt like a miracle. The landlord, Walter Garrison, met me at the front door on move-in day with a clipboard and a grin that stretched too wide across his face. He walked me through the house, pointing out the thermostat I shouldn't touch, the dishwasher that only worked on the light cycle, and the basement door at the end of the hallway. "Storage down there," he said, jangling his keys. "Each tenant gets a section, but that back room stays locked. Just old tools and equipment from when my father owned the place." I didn't think much about it those first few weeks. Between my nursing program clinicals and my part-time job at the campus bookstore, I barely had time to sleep, let alone worry about locked doors and basements. My roommates were decent enough people who kept to themselves. There was Bradley, an engineering student who lived on energy drinks and barely left his room. Natalie, who worked nights at a call center and slept during the day. And Jerome, who was finishing his MBA and spent most weekends at his girlfriend's place. We crossed paths in the kitchen occasionally, nodded politely, and went about our lives. The house had that weird quality old rentals have, where every floorboard announces your presence and the walls seem too thin for privacy, but somehow you still feel alone. My room sat directly above the basement, second door on the right from the stairs, with a window that faced the neighbor's fence and let in exactly 45 minutes of sunlight each afternoon. The coughing started on a Monday night in early October. I remember because I'd just submitted a huge pharmacology paper and was finally allowing myself 8 hours of sleep for the first time in weeks. Around 2 in the morning, this dry, rasping sound pulled me from a dream about missing an exam. At first, I thought it was Bradley down the hall, maybe catching a cold from all those late nights. But as I lay there in the dark, tracking the sound, I realized it was coming from below. Not just below, but directly beneath my bed. The cough had a muffled quality to it, like someone trying to suppress the noise by covering their mouth with fabric or their arm. It lasted maybe 30 seconds, these horrible wheezing bursts that made my chest hurt just listening to them, and then nothing. Complete silence except for the house settling and Natalie's alarm clock going off down the hall for her 3 a.m. shift. The next morning, I caught Walter in the driveway as he was leaving after fixing the garage door. "Hey, quick question," I said, trying to sound casual while holding my coffee mug like a shield between us. "Is there any way someone could be in the basement at night? I heard some weird noises." He barely glanced up from his phone, already walking toward his truck, a beat-up Ford with a cracked windshield and bumper stickers from 3 different political campaigns. "Probably the water heater," he said, climbing into the driver's seat. "Thing's older than you are, makes all kinds of racket when it kicks on. Had it checked last month, completely safe, just noisy." He pulled out before I could mention that water heaters don't usually cough, and I stood there in my pajama pants and oversized sweatshirt, feeling stupid for even asking. For 3 nights, nothing happened. I started to convince myself that maybe I'd dreamed the whole thing, or that sound travels weird in old houses, or that Bradley really did have a cold, and the acoustics just made it seem like it came from below. But that Friday, around midnight, the coughing returned. This time it went on for almost 5 minutes, these wet, desperate sounds that made me think of my grandfather in his last days at the hospice where I'd done my first clinical rotation. I grabbed my phone and recorded it, pressing the device against the floor to catch every wheeze and gasp. When I played it back with headphones, I could hear something else between the coughs, a rustling, like papers or plastic bags being moved around, and what might have been the squeak of old mattress springs. I sent the recording to Jerome since he was the only roommate I'd really talked to, and he responded immediately, even though it was past midnight. "That's definitely not the water heater. We should check it out." Jerome met me in the hallway 5 minutes later, holding a flashlight he'd grabbed from his car and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. We crept down to the basement like teenagers sneaking out after curfew, testing each step to avoid the creaky spots. The basement was exactly what you'd expect from a rental house built in the 70s. Concrete floors, exposed beams, that particular smell of damp cardboard and forgotten things. Our storage sections were clearly marked with masking tape and Sharpie, each tenant's name in Walter's blocky handwriting. Behind a wall of stacked boxes and an old refrigerator that hummed constantly, we could see the locked door. A padlock the size of my fist secured a metal latch that had been added recently, judging by the fresh scratch marks on the worn wood. Jerome aimed his flashlight at the gap beneath the door, and we both saw it at the same time. A thin strip of light, barely visible, like someone inside had a phone charging or a nightlight plugged in. We stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds, just staring at that sliver of light. Then, as if responding to our presence, the light shifted. A shadow passed across it, the unmistakable shape of feet moving on the other side. Jerome grabbed my arm hard enough to leave marks, and we both scrambled backward, nearly knocking over a tower of Christmas decoration boxes. Neither of us said anything until we were back upstairs in the kitchen, where Jerome poured himself a glass of water with shaking hands and downed it in one go. "We're calling the cops," he said, already pulling out his phone. But I stopped him, some ridiculous part of my brain still thinking about lease agreements and security deposits, and having to find a new place in the middle of the semester. "Let me try Walter one more time," I said. "If he doesn't give me a real answer, then we call." Jerome looked at me like I'd lost my mind, but he put his phone down and waited while I sent Walter a text with the video attached, telling him we knew someone was in the locked room and we needed answers now. Walter showed up 20 minutes later, which should have been my first red flag since he lived 40 minutes away. He was wearing sweatpants and a faded college hoodie, his hair sticking up like he'd just rolled out of bed, but his eyes were wide awake and darting between Jerome and me like he was calculating something. "You kids are being paranoid," he said. But his voice had this thin quality to it, stretched tight like a wire about to snap. "That room's been locked for years. Nobody could possibly be in there." I pulled up the video on my phone, turned the volume all the way up and played the coughing sounds. His face went through this series of expressions, from dismissive to concerned to something I couldn't quite read. "Fine," he finally said, pulling out his keys with dramatic reluctance. "I'll show you there's nothing in there but rusty tools and spider webs, and then I don't want to hear about this again." He started toward the basement stairs, then stopped and turned back to us. "Actually, wait here. Insurance, liability, and all that. I'll go check and come right back." Jerome and I looked at each other and simultaneously decided we weren't letting him go alone. We followed him down, our footsteps echoing his on the wooden stairs. Walter kept muttering under his breath, something about ungrateful tenants and market-rate rentals, but his hands were trembling as he fumbled with the padlock. The key stuck, and he had to jiggle it 3 times before the lock finally clicked open. He pushed the door inward, and the smell hit us immediately. Not decay or waste, but that concentrated human smell of unwashed clothes and stale breath and something medicinal, like cough syrup or benzocaine lozenges. The room was maybe 8 by 10 feet, with a camping cot pushed against one wall, a battery-powered lantern on an overturned milk crate, and grocery bags lined up along another wall. Empty soup cans were stacked in a corner next to a pile of pill bottles. But the worst part was the ceiling. Someone had drilled tiny holes in precise spots, each one positioned perfectly to look up into the rooms above. Into our bedrooms. Into our lives. "Oh God," Walter said, and for the first time he seemed genuinely shocked. "Gordon, what have you done?" That's when we heard the toilet flush from the small bathroom. I hadn't even noticed in the corner, just a toilet and sink behind a curtain made from a shower liner. A man emerged, probably in his 50s, wearing a dingy white undershirt and jeans that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. He had Walter's same narrow face but none of his nervous energy, just this hollow resignation like he'd been caught doing something inevitable. "I told you they'd find out," Gordon said to Walter, not even looking at Jerome and me. "Told you the girl's room was too close. She was bound to hear me." He sat down on the cot with a wheeze that turned into another coughing fit, this one lasting almost a minute while Walter stood there with his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. When Gordon finally stopped coughing, he looked directly at me for the first time. and his eyes had this horrible apologetic quality that made my skin prickle. "You take morning showers at 6:15, he said quietly. "Sometimes you sing that song about the astronaut. Pretty voice." Jerome already had his phone out, calling 911 while backing toward the door. I couldn't move, couldn't process that this man, Gordon, had been living beneath me for months, watching through those horrible little holes, knowing my schedule better than I did. Walter started babbling, trying to explain that Gordon was his brother, that he'd lost his job and then his apartment, that it was supposed to be temporary, just a few weeks until he got back on his feet. "He's sick," Walter kept saying, as if that explained everything. "He's got respiratory problems, can't afford doctors. I couldn't just leave him on the street." But Gordon wasn't listening to his brother's excuses. He was looking at the holes in the ceiling with this weird pride, running his fingers along the wood. "Had to be real careful with the placement," he said to no one in particular. "Quarter-inch bit, just enough to see through but not enough for anyone to notice from above. The one over your desk is my favorite. You study so hard, writing all those notes about medications and patient care. Sometimes I pretend you're taking care of me." The police arrived within 10 minutes. 3 cars with lights but no sirens. They took Gordon away first, and he went without resistance, just asked Walter to grab his medications from the milk crate. The officers photographed everything, measured the holes, bagged the empty food containers and pill bottles. One of them, a woman with sergeant stripes, told us we'd all need to give statements, and that the house would be off limits for at least 48 hours while they processed the scene. Walter they arrested too, for criminal facilitation and endangerment. As they led him to the squad car, he kept trying to catch my eye, maybe wanting forgiveness or understanding, but I stared at the ground until the car door slammed shut. Jerome and I sat on the front steps until our other roommates got home. Then we all went to Bradley's girlfriend's apartment, cramming into her living room with sleeping bags and the weird energy of survivors from the same disaster. None of us ever went back to that house except to get our belongings with a police escort. I found a studio apartment the next week that cost twice as much and had terrible water pressure. But the floors were solid concrete and there was no basement, and that was all that mattered. The closing papers for my house came through on a Wednesday morning in late February, and honestly, I should have trusted my gut when the real estate agent kept adjusting her glasses and clearing her throat during the final walkthrough. But after 6 months of crashing on my sister's couch following the divorce, any place with my own walls felt like salvation. The house sat on a quiet cul-de-sac in Riverside Heights, one of those neighborhoods where people still put up seasonal decorations and kids actually played in the yards. Built in 1978, the split level had good bones underneath the outdated wallpaper and worn carpet, nothing that some sweat equity couldn't fix. What really sold me was the price, almost $40,000 under market value, because the previous owner, an elderly woman named Dorothy Brennan, had died in the master bedroom and the family wanted a quick sale. Death didn't bother me. At my age, having just watched my 10-year marriage flatline, I figured I could handle sharing space with whatever energy Dorothy left behind. My first 2 weeks there passed in a blur of unpacking boxes and making lists of everything that needed fixing, from the leaky kitchen faucet to the wood paneling in the den that belonged in a time capsule. The basement became my designated storage area for things I wasn't ready to deal with yet, mostly photo albums and wedding gifts that felt too complicated to sort through. It was your typical unfinished basement, concrete floors and exposed beams, with an ancient furnace that groaned like it was digesting something whenever it kicked on. That's what I told myself when I first heard the noises anyway. Just the furnace doing its 45-year-old furnace thing. The sounds usually started around 2 in the morning, these soft creaking noises that drifted up through the heating vents. Old houses make noise, everyone knows that. And after living in a modern apartment complex where I could hear my neighbor's coffee maker through the walls, a few creaks seemed like a fair trade for actual privacy. Everything changed on a Sunday night in March when I went down to grab my winter boots from storage. because the weather guy promised one last snowstorm before spring. The pull-string light barely reached the corners of the basement, casting these long shadows behind the water heater and the massive boiler that looked like something from a submarine movie. Behind the boiler, tucked into a gap between the unit and the wall, I found 3 Marlboro red cigarette butts arranged in a neat little line on the concrete floor. My whole body went rigid, like when you miss a step going downstairs and your stomach does that horrible flip. Nobody in my family smoked, hadn't had a single visitor who smoked, and the home inspector definitely would have mentioned finding cigarette butts during his inspection. Right next to the butts sat a Poland Spring water bottle, the label peeled halfway off, with maybe 2 inches of water still sloshing around inside. The plastic was soft, like someone had been gripping it recently, and when I picked it up with my sleeve pulled over my hand, the water inside was room temperature, not the icy cold you'd expect from something abandoned in a basement for weeks. I told myself Dorothy's family must have left it when they cleared out her belongings, maybe took smoke breaks while sorting through 40 years of accumulated stuff, even though the house had been empty for 3 months before I moved in. But that night, I barely slept, jerking awake every time the heat kicked on or a tree branch scraped the siding. The next morning, I called a locksmith and had him install new deadbolts on every exterior door, the expensive kind that couldn't be picked by some YouTube tutorial. Then I went through every window in the house, checking locks and adding these metal security bars to the basement windows that the guy at Home Depot assured me would stop anyone bigger than a raccoon. For good measure, I started leaving lights on when I went to bed. The kitchen, the hallway. Sometimes the basement too, my electric bill be damned. But even with all that, I kept finding myself standing at the top of the basement stairs at random times, listening for sounds that didn't belong, my hand hovering over the light switch like I was afraid of what I might see if I turned it on. 2 weeks passed without incident, and I had almost convinced myself that I'd overreacted, that living alone after a decade of marriage had made me jumpy and paranoid about normal house stuff. Then came the morning I found my back door unlocked, the one that led from the kitchen to the backyard, the one I specifically remembered checking twice before bed because it had become part of my nightly ritual, along with testing every window latch. The door was still closed, just unlocked. The deadbolt turned to the open position like someone had used a key. My coffee mug slipped right out of my hand, shattering on the linoleum and sending hot coffee across my bare feet. But I barely felt the burn. I grabbed my phone and almost called 911. But what would I say? That my door was unlocked and maybe I was just losing my mind from stress. Instead, I called my brother Kevin, who lived 40 minutes away. And while I waited for him to show up, I sat in my car in the driveway with the engine running, watching my own house like it might suddenly reveal its secrets. Kevin spent 2 hours going through the house with me, checking every closet, every corner, even the crawl space above the garage that required a ladder to access. We found nothing missing, nothing disturbed, just that unlocked door that he suggested might be a faulty mechanism, or maybe I'd forgotten despite being certain, absolutely certain, that I'd checked it. But when we went down to the basement to check the window locks, we found something that made Kevin stop talking mid-sentence about getting me a security system. Behind the boiler, in that same spot where I'd found the cigarettes, sat a McDonald's bag, grease-stained and crumpled, with a receipt dated from the previous night at 11:47 p.m. Inside were the remnants of a Big Mac meal, half-eaten, the fries still soft like they'd been sitting there for just a few hours. The smell hit us both at the same time, that distinctive fast food smell that definitely hadn't been there when I'd done laundry in the basement 2 days earlier. Kevin's face went pale, and he pulled out his phone to call the police while ushering me back upstairs, his hand on my back like he was afraid something might grab me if we didn't move fast enough. The police treated it like a standard break-in at first, 2 officers who looked barely older than my nephew taking notes while walking through the house with their hands resting on their utility belts. They found the point of entry within 10 minutes, a basement window on the north side of the house where someone had carefully removed the security bar screws from the outside, the holes hidden behind a rhododendron bush that grew thick against the foundation. The frame showed fresh tool marks where someone had pried it open repeatedly, probably over several nights, working the lock mechanism until they'd figured out how to pop it silently. Officer Ramirez, the one with a thin scar through his left eyebrow, showed me how the intruder had been replacing the screws each time they left, making everything look normal from a casual glance. They documented everything, took photos, dusted for prints around the window and the boiler area, but both officers kept exchanging these looks that made my chest feel tight. When I asked what would happen next, Officer Carson, the younger one with freckles across his nose, said they'd increase patrols in the neighborhood, but admitted that without cameras or witnesses, catching someone who only came at night would be like finding a specific fish in Lake Superior. That afternoon, I spent $300 I didn't really have on security cameras from Best Buy, the kind that sent alerts to your phone when they detected motion. Kevin helped me set them up, one at each entrance, one in the hallway, and two in the basement, including one pointed directly at that window. We also moved my bedroom furniture so my bed sat against the far wall with clear sight lines to both the door and window, and Kevin insisted on installing this metal security bar that wedged under the doorknob, said he'd seen it on some crime show and it actually worked. Before he left, he tried to convince me to stay at his place for a while, but his wife had just had their third kid, and their house was already chaos without adding my drama to it. Instead, I promised to call him every night before bed and first thing in the morning, our own little check-in system that made us both feel better, even though we knew it wouldn't actually stop anything from happening. That first night with the cameras, I sat up in bed with my laptop open, watching the feeds like they were the most important TV show ever made, jumping every time a moth flew past the lens or the timestamp updated. For 3 nights, nothing happened except for a stray cat that triggered the basement camera and nearly gave me a heart attack at 3 a.m. when my phone started buzzing with motion alerts. I'd actually started to relax a little, thinking maybe the police visit had scared whoever it was away, that they'd moved on to some other house without cameras and paranoid owners who checked their locks 15 times before bed. Then on Friday night, exhausted from a week of barely sleeping, I made the mistake of taking 2 Benadryl to knock myself out, figuring the camera alerts would wake me if anything happened. I woke up Saturday morning feeling groggy and disoriented, my mouth dry like I'd been breathing through it all night, and when I checked my phone, there were 14 motion alerts from between 1:47 a.m. and 4:33 a.m. My fingers shook so bad I could barely unlock my phone, and when I finally got the camera app open, what I saw made me run to the bathroom and throw up the nothing that was in my stomach, just bile that burned my throat while tears streamed down my face. The footage showed a man entering through the basement window at 1:47 a.m., moving with the kind of confidence that comes from practice, like he'd done this so many times he could navigate my basement in the dark. He was wearing a baseball cap pulled low and what looked like a maintenance company jacket, the kind with reflective stripes that made him look like he belonged there if anyone happened to glance through a window. The infrared camera made his eyes look like white circles as he walked directly to the stairs, not hesitating, not searching, just walking like he owned the place. The hallway camera caught him at 2:15 a.m., standing at my bedroom door, his hand on the knob, just standing there for a full 4 minutes without moving. And I realized with horror that he was listening to me breathe, waiting to see if I was truly asleep. Then he opened the door so slowly that it took another 2 minutes for it to fully open and disappeared into my room where I didn't have a camera because who puts a camera in their own bedroom? The next footage was him leaving my room at 3:58 a.m., walking backward while carefully closing the door, and in his hand was my phone charger, the pink one with the butterfly sticker that I'd been looking for all week, assuming I'd misplaced it somewhere. I called 911 while still sitting on my bathroom floor, barely able to form words through the sobbing, and this time they sent 3 patrol cars and a detective named Heather Novak, who had this way of making me feel like she actually believed every word I said. When she watched the footage, she immediately recognized something I'd missed in my panic, a small tattoo on the man's left hand, a distinctive pattern that looked like interlocking triangles. She asked me about previous maintenance work on the house, and suddenly, it clicked. The property management company that handled the rental before Dorothy bought it had sent someone to service the boiler just 2 months before she died. Detective Novak made some calls, and within an hour, she had a name. Carl Brenner, 43 years old, who'd been fired from Citywide Property Services 8 months ago for complaints about entering rental properties without notice. The company still had his photo on file, and even though the baseball cap obscured most of his face in my footage, that hand tattoo was unmistakable, those same interlocking triangles he'd apparently gotten during his time in the military, according to his employment records. They arrested Carl that same afternoon at his apartment in Fairfield, just 12 miles from my house, and what they found there made Detective Novak call me personally to come to the station, warning me I might want to bring someone for support. In a back room that Carl used as an office, they found hundreds of photos printed from a computer, photos of me sleeping, photos of me cooking dinner, photos of me watching TV on my couch, all taken from inside my house over the past month. But mixed in with mine were other photos, other women in other houses, some dating back 2 years, each set labeled with addresses and dates in neat handwriting on manila folders. He had keys to 17 different properties, including mine, which he'd apparently copied during his maintenance visits, and a notebook where he documented the routines of each house's occupants, when they slept, when they showered, when they were away at work. Detective Novak said in her 15 years on the force, she'd never seen anything quite like it. This methodical invasion of privacy that wasn't about theft or assault, but something else. Some need to exist in other people's spaces without their knowledge, to watch them in their most vulnerable moments. Carl never said a word during interrogation, just sat there with this blank expression, and eventually asked for a lawyer, but the evidence was overwhelming, and the prosecutor charged him with multiple counts of breaking and entering, stalking, and criminal trespass. The trial happened 6 months later, and by then I'd already moved back in with my sister, unable to sleep in that house even after changing every lock and installing an alarm system that cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. During the proceedings, we learned that Carl had been doing this since his divorce in 2017, starting with his ex-wife's apartment, then expanding to places he'd serviced during his maintenance job. The prosecutor brought in a psychologist who testified about voyeuristic disorders and violation of privacy as a form of control, using words like parasitic intimacy that made everyone in the courtroom shift uncomfortably in their seats. 16 other women came forward to testify, each with their own version of my story, finding cigarette butts, missing small items, that persistent feeling that someone had been in their space. One woman from Oak Harbor broke down completely when she described finding an impression on her bed's comforter, where someone had laid down next to her while she slept, the shape still visible when she woke up one morning. Carl got 11 years in state prison, eligible for parole in 7 with good behavior, which seems like nothing compared to the life sentence he gave all of us, who can't look at an unlocked door or a basement window without remembering. I sold the house 3 months after the trial, taking a $15,000 loss just to be free of it, and the realtor had to disclose the stalking incident to potential buyers, which meant it sat on the market for 4 months before a young couple from out of state bought it, probably thinking they were getting a deal. Sometimes I drive by there, not intentionally, but that neighborhood sits between my sister's place and the grocery store I like, and I see they've painted it yellow, added a garden, normal life continuing in a space that still shows up in my nightmares. The thing that stays with me most isn't even the violation itself, but this one detail from the trial, where they showed a photo from Carl's apartment of a coffee mug he'd taken from my kitchen, my favorite one with a cartoon cat that said "Coffee right meow," sitting on his kitchen counter like it belonged there. He'd been drinking from it every morning while looking at those photos of me, creating this twisted parallel life where he inhabited my spaces even when he wasn't physically there, and that image haunts me more than any footage of him standing in my bedroom doorway, because it means that even when I thought I was alone and safe, some part of my life was always bleeding into his. September in that basement apartment felt like hiding from the world, which was exactly what I needed. Willow Drive wasn't much to look at, just rows of old houses converted into rentals, but at $600 a month I couldn't complain. 29 candles on my last birthday cake, and here I was, starting fresh after Janet and I called it quits. The landlord, an older guy named Frank, lived upstairs with his wife and kept to himself mostly. During move-in day, the neighbor from next door, Gregory, appeared at my door offering to help with the heavy stuff. He was probably in his 50s, thin guy with calloused hands, said he worked night shifts at some warehouse across town. Made a joke about how our basements were identical, just mirror images of each other, while we struggled to angle my couch down those narrow stairs. Even offered to lend me tools if I needed anything fixed, which seemed neighborly enough at the time. After about 2 weeks of living there, small things in my kitchen started seeming out of place. My coffee mug would be turned handle left when I always left it handle right. The wooden spoon I kept in the drawer next to the stove would migrate to the drawer by the sink. A jar of peanut butter I swore I'd pushed to the back of the cabinet would be sitting at the front edge when I got home from my accounting job downtown. Figured my brain was still scrambled from the divorce stress, especially since I was surviving on maybe 4 hours of sleep a night, scrolling through apartment listings for something better while trying to rebuild my savings. Started doubting myself, even wrote notes about where I put things. The kitchen was cramped, maybe 8 feet by 6 feet, old appliances that hummed too loud, cracked linoleum that curled at the edges. Then came that Wednesday in October when things got harder to explain away. Left for work at 7:30 sharp like always, and I specifically remember washing my breakfast bowl and placing it upside down on the dish rack. When I got home around 6 that evening, the bowl was right side up with 3 drops of water pooled at the bottom, not just moved but used. The dish soap bottle had shifted from the left side of the sink to the right, and there was a different sponge on the counter, still damp. Called Frank immediately, asked if he'd sent someone down for maintenance, or if maybe his wife had needed to check something. He sounded confused, said nobody had any reason to enter my apartment, reminded me I had the only key besides his emergency copy, which was hanging in his kitchen where it always stayed. That night I couldn't settle down. Kept getting up to double-check the deadbolt, even wedged a chair under the doorknob like my dad used to do when we stayed in sketchy motels during road trips. Around 2 in the morning, lying there in the dark, listening to the furnace cycle on and off, I heard something that made my whole body go rigid. The distinct sound of a drawer sliding open in my kitchen, that specific sticky catch the silverware drawer made because of the humidity. Then the soft rattle of utensils followed by the drawer rolling shut. My bedroom was only about 15 feet from the kitchen, just a thin wall between us. I held my breath, phone already in my hand, thumb hovering over the emergency call button. Could hear my pulse hammering in my ears while I waited, listening for footsteps, for any other sound. Another drawer opened, the one with the heavier sound, where I kept the dish towels and oven mitts. The intruder was methodical, unhurried, like someone familiar with the layout. I pressed 911, whispered to the dispatcher that someone was in my apartment, gave the address twice to make sure she got it right. She told me to stay where I was, keep the door locked, officers were on their way. But then I heard something that made no sense at all. The microwave door opened and closed, followed by the beep of buttons being pressed, but no hum of it actually running. Just someone pressing buttons in the dark. The fridge opened next, that broken seal making its characteristic sucking sound, and I could hear containers being shifted around, the clink of glass jars touching. The sirens came within 8 minutes, though it felt like hours lying there listening to someone moving through my kitchen, like they owned it. When the red and blue lights started flashing through those ground-level windows, the sounds stopped instantly. Not gradually, not with footsteps running away, just stopped like someone had hit a switch. The officers knocked loud, announcing themselves, and I practically ran to let them in, explaining about the sounds, pointing toward the kitchen. 2 of them went in with flashlights while a third stayed with me by the door. They checked everything, the closets, the bathroom, behind the water heater, even looked up at the ceiling tiles. The kitchen drawers were all closed, Nothing visibly out of place, but I knew someone had been there. The younger officer, Officer Daniels according to his badge, started asking about windows, pointing out that they were all locked from the inside with no signs of tampering. The door showed no damage either, deadbolt still solid. The older cop, Officer Ruiz, was running his flashlight along the walls, checking for any openings, when he stopped at the back corner of my bedroom. There was a section of wood paneling that looked slightly different from the rest, the grain pattern not quite matching. He pushed on it, and it gave way slightly, like it wasn't properly secured. Called his partner over, and together they pulled at the edges until the whole panel came loose, revealing a rough opening about 3 feet wide and 2 feet tall. Behind that panel was pure darkness that their flashlights couldn't quite penetrate at first. Officer Ruiz got down on his knees, aimed his light inside, and immediately pulled back, calling for backup on his radio. The crawl space extended beyond what the beam could reach, with fresh scuff marks in the dust and what looked like knee prints leading away from the opening. They told me to pack a bag, that I couldn't stay there tonight. While we waited for more officers, Gregory from next door came out in his bathrobe, asking about all the commotion, said the lights woke him up. Stood there on his porch with this concerned expression, arms crossed against the cold, watching everything unfold. Officer Daniels went to question him while Ruiz stayed with me, but Gregory just shook his head, said he'd been dead asleep until the sirens. When backup arrived with better equipment, they sent Officer Park, a smaller woman who volunteered to go through the crawl space with a helmet cam and heavy-duty flashlight. We watched the feed on a laptop in the police car, and my stomach turned as the tunnel curved left, then right, clearly man-made with support beams every few feet. After about 30 feet of crawling, she reached another opening, this one covered by a piece of thin plywood that pushed out easily. She emerged into what looked like another basement, and I heard her radio crackle as she described seeing a workbench with tools, shelving units, and a water heater in the corner. Then she turned her light toward the wall and found something that made everyone in the car go silent. Photos taped up in neat rows, dozens of them, all taken from inside my apartment. Me cooking dinner, washing dishes, even one of me sleeping on the couch after a long day. The detective who'd just arrived, Detective Morrison, immediately got a warrant for Gregory's house while Officer Park stayed in position. Within 20 minutes, they were at his door with the paperwork. Gregory answered calmly, like he'd been expecting them, didn't even protest when they told him to step outside. Inside his basement, exactly where Officer Park had emerged, they found the other end of the tunnel system. But it was what they found on his workbench that really got to me. My missing spare key from when I'd first moved in, the one I thought I'd misplaced while unpacking. A notebook with detailed schedules of when I left for work, when I got home, when I typically went to bed. Even had notes about my coffee preference and which drawer I kept the batteries in. The photos went back to my second day living there, hundreds of them organized by date in a filing cabinet. They arrested Gregory right there on his porch, didn't even let him go back inside for shoes. As they put him in the patrol car, he looked straight at me through the window, no expression at all, just staring like I was still something to observe. Detective Morrison told me later that Gregory had dug that tunnel over the course of 3 years, long before I'd moved in. The previous tenant, a college student named Ryan, had complained about missing food and moved out after just 2 months. But nobody had believed him about someone being in his apartment. They found photos of Ryan too, tucked in a separate folder, along with images of the tenant before him. Gregory had apparently been using that tunnel for years, treating whoever lived there like his personal reality show. Frank felt terrible about the whole thing, refunded my entire security deposit plus 2 months of rent, even though it wasn't his fault. He had contractors come seal up that wall with concrete, no more panels, no more access points. But I couldn't stay there. Moved in with a coworker for a few weeks until I found a studio apartment on the 3rd floor of a building downtown, one with cameras in the hallways and a doorman who worked nights. Gregory got 18 months for stalking and breaking and entering, which didn't feel like nearly enough. Sometimes I still wake up at 2 in the morning, listening for drawers opening, for sounds that shouldn't be there. Check my kitchen twice before bed, making sure everything is exactly where I left it. The therapist says it'll fade with time, that hypervigilance after something like this is normal. Maybe she's right, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never live in a basement again. Mason's mother had been gone for 3 months when the noises started in our basement, leaving just the two of us rattling around that split-level house outside Columbus. My son was 9, obsessed with collecting those little metal soldier figures that he'd line up in battle formations across his bedroom floor. We'd grabbed this place in a rush right before school started. One of those 80s builds with yellowish vinyl siding, and a furnace that sounded like it was clearing its throat every time it kicked on. The realtor had knocked $8,000 off the asking price because of the outdated kitchen and the basement that smelled like wet newspaper. But honestly, we just needed somewhere to start over. Mason claimed the upstairs bedroom while I took the master on the main floor, close enough to hear when those nightmares hit him around 2 or 3 in the morning, which happened more often than I'd like to admit. That first Monday in October, I remember specifically because Mason had just brought home straight A's on his report card. I woke up to this metallic scraping sound coming from below, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone filing down a piece of steel. The sound stopped and started in intervals, maybe 10 seconds of scraping, then silence, then scraping again. Mixed in with it, I could hear voices, 2 people having what sounded like a completely normal conversation, though the words were too muffled to make out through the floorboards. My first instinct was to check on Mason since he'd been sleepwalking lately, once even making it all the way to the kitchen where I found him trying to pour cereal at 3 in the morning. But when I cracked his door open, there he was, one arm dangling off the bed, mouth slightly open. Those dinosaur sheets twisted around his legs. The talking downstairs continued, casual and unhurried, like 2 guys discussing a project. I pulled the heavy mag light from my nightstand, the metal cold in my palm, and headed for the basement door off the kitchen. The second I turned the doorknob, everything went dead quiet, that kind of silence that feels intentional, like someone holding their breath. I waited there in my boxers and t-shirt, ear pressed against the door, counting to 30 in my head before flipping the light switch. Click. Nothing. The bulb was dead or missing, leaving just a black hole where the stairs descended. I aimed the mag light down those wooden steps, the beam cutting through dust particles that danced in the air like tiny insects. Each stair groaned under my weight, that old wood sound that makes you wonder if the whole thing might give way. The basement stretched out in front of me, mostly empty except for our moving boxes stacked against one wall, and that workbench the previous owners had left behind, its surface covered in rusty brackets and old paint cans. I swept the light across every corner, checking behind the water heater, around the furnace, even inside the utility closet where the electrical panel lived. Nobody. The concrete floor showed no footprints except my own dusty ones from when we'd moved boxes down there. But there was this smell I hadn't noticed before, kind of industrial, like machine oil mixed with something else, maybe rubber or heated plastic. The side door that led out to the backyard was still padlocked from the inside, the tiny window next to it so covered in grime you couldn't see through it even in daylight. For the next few nights I stayed up late, sitting in the living room with the TV on mute, just listening. The house had its regular sounds, the refrigerator humming, the heating ducts ticking as they cooled, but nothing from the basement. Started thinking maybe I'd dreamed the whole thing, or maybe it was mice in the walls, though mice don't usually have conversations. By Friday, I'd almost convinced myself to forget about it, even joked with my co-worker Phil about needing more coffee to stop hallucinating. Then the following Wednesday rolled around and everything changed. I'd taken a half-day off work to deal with some paperwork at Mason's school. Something about updating emergency contact information now that his mother was out of the picture. Got back to the house around 1:30 in the afternoon, pulling into the driveway behind a white van I didn't recognize. No company logos, no writing on the sides, Just a plain white panel van with tinted rear windows and a license plate so mud-covered I couldn't read it. Before I could even process why there was a van in my driveway, the side door of my basement burst open, and two men came walking out like they owned the place. Both wore those neon yellow reflective vests, the kind construction workers use, hard hats tucked under their arms carrying what looked like metal detectors or some kind of scanning equipment. The taller one, maybe 6'3" with a thick mustache that reminded me of a push broom, saw me getting out of my car and actually waved, casual as could be. The shorter guy, stocky with arms like ham hocks and a neck tattoo peeking out from his collar, was already heading toward the van's rear doors. They moved with this practiced efficiency, no hesitation, no surprise at seeing me, like running into the homeowner was just part of their regular routine. The tall one called out something about checking the lines, gestured vaguely toward the street where I could see orange cones set up that definitely hadn't been there when I left. I stood there for maybe 3 seconds, keys still in my hand, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. These guys had just walked out of my locked basement, the one with the padlock I'd checked myself that morning. The tall one was already at the van, sliding his equipment into the back while his partner climbed into the driver's seat. When I finally found my voice and asked what the hell they were doing in my house, the tall one just pointed at his vest like that explained everything, mumbled something about Columbia Gas checking for leaks, routine maintenance, should have gotten a notice. His partner had already started the engine, revving it impatiently, and before I could ask another question, the tall guy hopped in and they peeled out, leaving tire marks on my driveway. The whole encounter lasted maybe 45 seconds, but something about how smooth it was, how rehearsed, made every alarm bell in my head go off at once. I ran to the basement door, still standing wide open, the padlock dangling from the hasp, somehow unlocked. The mechanism wasn't broken or cut, just opened clean, like they had a key or picked it with professional tools. Down in the basement, that industrial smell hit me stronger than before, and I noticed things I'd missed in the dark with just my flashlight. Fresh scratches on the concrete floor near the wall, like something heavy had been dragged. A section of drywall in the corner looked newer than the rest, the paint slightly brighter white, the texture different. One of our moving boxes had been shifted, and when I checked inside, someone had gone through our old photo albums, a few pictures scattered on the floor beneath the box. The pictures were all of Mason as a baby, birthday parties, first day of kindergarten, him with his mother before she left. My chest got tight seeing those photos touched by strangers' hands, and I grabbed my phone to call the police, but then stopped, realizing how insane this would sound without proof. Instead, I called Columbia Gas first, going through 3 different customer service representatives, before reaching someone who could actually check service records. The woman on the phone, Sharon, sounded increasingly concerned as she searched their system, finally telling me in this careful voice that no Columbia Gas crews had been dispatched to my address in over 2 years, and certainly not today. She asked if I wanted to file a report about impersonation, said it was a serious crime, that people sometimes posed as utility workers to case houses for burglaries. While she was talking, I walked around the basement perimeter, running my hand along the walls, and that's when I felt it. A draft coming from behind that newer section of drywall. Not strong, but definitely there. Cold air flowing from somewhere it shouldn't be. Sharon was still talking about security protocols when I grabbed a screwdriver from the workbench and started prying at the edge of that fresh drywall section. The drywall came away easier than it should have, just held in place with a few finishing nails, revealing a hole about 3 feet wide cut straight through the concrete foundation. Professional work, smooth edges, probably done with a concrete saw, the kind contractors use for major renovations. Beyond the hole was a corrugated metal pipe, one of those big storm drain tubes that run under neighborhoods to handle rainwater runoff. The pipe had to be at least 4 feet in diameter, big enough for a grown man to walk through if he hunched over a bit. I could see footprints in the sediment at the bottom, lots of them, going both directions, and that industrial smell was overwhelming now, mixing with the musty stench of stagnant water and decay. My flashlight beam couldn't reach the end of the tunnel in either direction, just disappeared into blackness that seemed to go on forever. Called 911 right then, told them about the break-in, the fake utility workers, and this tunnel I'd just discovered leading straight into the storm drain system. The cops showed up within 10 minutes, 2 patrol cars, and then a detective in an unmarked sedan who introduced himself as Detective Hoffman. He was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, wearing a wrinkled suit that looked like he'd slept in it, but his eyes were sharp, taking in every detail as I walked him through what happened. When he saw the tunnel opening, he immediately called for backup and a crime scene unit, then got on his radio requesting someone from the city's public works department. While we waited, he asked me detailed questions about the 2 men, had me describe everything I could remember: their height, weight, distinguishing features, the van, even the way they walked. The crime scene techs arrived and started photographing everything, dusting for prints on the drywall edges and the padlock, taking samples of the sediment from inside the tunnel entrance. One of them, a woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun, told Hoffman she could see tool marks on the concrete. Definitely a professional job. Probably took days to cut through. The guy from Public Works showed up about an hour later, an older man named Eddie who'd been working the city sewers for 23 years, knew every pipe and drain in Columbus like the back of his hand. He took one look at the tunnel entrance and his face went pale. Started muttering about how this section of storm drain had been sealed off in 2016 after a homeless camp got flooded out during heavy rains. Said the city had welded shut all the access points, installed security grates, the whole 9 yards, specifically to keep people from getting in there. But here was proof someone had not only gotten in but had been using it as their own private highway under the neighborhood. Eddie pulled up schematics on his tablet, showing Hoffman where the drain ran, and my stomach dropped when I saw it connected to at least 12 other houses on our street, with multiple entry points that led to maintenance hatches scattered throughout the area. Any of those houses could have the same kind of hidden entrance, and the people living there would never know. Hoffman made the decision to send officers into the tunnel while we evacuated to a hotel. Said it wasn't safe for Mason and me to stay there until they figured out what they were dealing with. I packed bags for both of us while trying not to alarm Mason. Told him we were having an adventure, like camping but in a hotel with a pool. Poor kid was excited about the pool, had no idea why his dad's hands were shaking while folding his dinosaur pajamas. Before we left, I watched them send in 2 officers wearing hazmat suits and headlamps, tethered to safety lines in case the tunnel had any surprises. They came back out 20 minutes later with evidence bags full of stuff they'd found down there. Copper piping that had been stripped from somewhere, what looked like mail from different addresses, even a laptop in a waterproof case. One of the officers, his face sheet white despite the exertion, told Hoffman they'd found makeshift camps set up at various points, sleeping bags, camp stoves, stockpiles of food, and something else that made him stop talking when he noticed I was listening. Hoffman walked me to my car, said they'd post an officer at the hotel, gave me his card with his personal cell number written on the back, told me to call if I remembered anything else or if anyone tried to contact me. That night at the hotel, Mason splashed in the pool while I sat on a plastic chair watching him, my phone buzzing every few minutes with updates from Hoffman. They'd arrested 6 people by midnight, all found at different points in the tunnel system, including the 2 guys I'd described from my driveway. The tall one with the mustache turned out to be a former city employee who'd been fired from the water department 5 years ago for stealing equipment. His partner was his cousin, both of them with rap sheets full of burglary and theft charges going back a decade. The other 4 were people nobody expected: a woman who worked at a nearby grocery store, 2 brothers who ran a scrap metal business, and most disturbing, a man who'd been reported missing by his family 3 years ago. They'd been living down there, had turned that abandoned storm drain into their own underground network, complete with stolen electricity tapped from junction boxes and water siphoned from supply lines. The metallic scraping I'd heard that first night was them cutting through pipes in neighboring basements, harvesting copper to sell, and the talking was them planning which house to hit next. What really got me was when Hoffman called the next morning to tell me what else they'd discovered. Those photos of Mason they'd been looking through weren't random curiosity. They'd found notebooks in one of the camps with detailed information about every family on our street, schedules, when people left for work, when kids got home from school, who had dogs, who had security systems. My house was marked as single father, 1 child, no dog, basic locks, basement access confirmed. They'd been watching us for weeks before they even cut through our foundation, knew exactly when they could work without being heard, knew I wouldn't be home that Wednesday afternoon because they'd seen me leave at the same time the previous week for Mason's school appointment. The whole operation was sophisticated in a way that made my skin prickle. These weren't just random criminals, but people who'd turned violating others' homes into a science. The city ended up evacuating the entire street for a week, while they sealed every access point with reinforced concrete, installed monitoring equipment, and swept the whole system for anyone else who might be down there. They found 2 more people on the 3rd day, living so deep in the system they hadn't even known about the arrests, surviving on canned goods and rainwater like some kind of post-apocalyptic scenario playing out beneath our suburban street. We never went back to that house. I broke the lease, took the financial hit, didn't care about losing the security deposit or the penalties. Found us the apartment on the 7th floor of a building downtown, one with a doorman, security cameras in every hallway, and most importantly, no basement. Mason adjusted better than I expected, though he still asks sometimes why we had to move so suddenly, why we couldn't go back for the rest of his toys. I tell him the house had problems. Leave it at that. Figure when he's older I'll explain the whole thing if he really wants to know. The nightmares he'd been having after his mother left actually stopped after we moved. Like somehow his subconscious knew we were safer in that concrete tower than we'd ever been in that house with its hidden vulnerabilities. All 8 people they arrested got prison time, sentences ranging from 18 months to 7 years for the ringleaders, though that feels like nothing compared to the violation they put our whole neighborhood through. 6 months later, I ran into one of our old neighbors at a Kroger across town, a woman named Beth who'd lived 3 houses down from us. She told me they'd sold too, couldn't sleep knowing what had been happening literally beneath their feet all that time. Said the whole street had basically emptied out within a year, property values tanked, and the city was still dealing with lawsuits from families who'd discovered evidence of intrusion in their homes during the investigation. Pictures missing, items moved, food taken from refrigerators, little violations that suddenly made sense in the context of what had been discovered. She mentioned they'd found DNA evidence in 7 different houses, proving the tunnel people had been coming up into homes for months, maybe years, whenever they knew families were away. The strangest part was learning later from the prosecution files that the man who'd been missing for 3 years, the one living in the tunnels, had actually chosen to be there, had left his family to join this underground community because he believed society above ground was collapsing. Even now, writing this at my desk in our new place with the city lights twinkling outside, I still check the locks 3 times before bed, still wake up at the slightest unusual sound, still feel that primitive fear when I hear something that reminds me of metal scraping against concrete. The notification from RoomShare popped up on my phone during a particularly rough month in 2022, right when Jenna and I were staring at our credit card statements spread across the kitchen table. We'd bought the house in Denver the previous year, convinced we could handle the mortgage on our combined salaries. But between the car breaking down and her dad's medical bills, things had gotten tight. The basement had its own entrance around the side of the house, a full bathroom, and enough space for someone to live comfortably. So when Jenna suggested renting it out, I figured why not. The app made everything seem so easy and safe, with background checks and verified profiles. And within 3 days, we had our first serious inquiry from someone named Thomas Brennan, who said he worked nights at a warehouse and just needed a quiet place to sleep during the day. Thomas showed up on a Saturday morning to view the space, and I remember thinking how unremarkable he looked. Just an average guy in his 40s with thinning brown hair and clothes that seemed deliberately chosen to blend in. Khakis and a plain blue polo shirt. He barely spoke above a whisper when he talked, had this way of nodding along to everything we said, and paid 3 months up front in cash, which should have been my first red flag, but honestly just felt like a relief at the time. He moved in with just 2 suitcases and a laptop bag, said he traveled light because of his job, and for the first couple weeks everything seemed perfect. He was so quiet we sometimes forgot he was even down there, never asked for anything, never complained about the old water heater that made that weird knocking sound, and always left his rent money in an envelope taped to our back door on the 1st of each month, even though I told him he could just transfer it through the app. About a month in, Jenna started mentioning these little things that didn't quite add up, like how she'd never heard him use the microwave or the TV we'd left down there, never smelled food cooking, never heard water running except for the toilet flushing occasionally. She worked from home doing medical transcription and said the basement was dead silent all day, even though Thomas supposedly slept during those hours after his night shifts. We'd see him leaving around 9 at night through the side entrance, always carrying the same black backpack, always wearing dark clothes, and he'd return around 6 in the morning, though sometimes I'd catch glimpses of movement through the basement window at odd hours when he should have been at work. The strangest part was the darkness. We never saw lights on down there, not even the glow from a phone screen or laptop. Just complete blackness behind those small rectangular windows at ground level. One evening I went down to check the water meter, which was in a utility closet in the basement hallway, and noticed Thomas had installed a deadbolt on his door from the inside, one of those heavy-duty ones you'd see on a front door. When I knocked to ask about it, just making conversation really, he opened the door maybe 3 inches, his face partially hidden in the shadows, and explained in that soft voice that he had expensive equipment for his work and felt better with extra security. The smell that came from his room was odd, not bad exactly, but sharp and chemical, like fresh plastic mixed with something metallic, and I could hear this faint humming sound, maybe a fan or some kind of machine running. He must have seen me trying to peer past him because he shifted his body to block my view completely, then thanked me for understanding about the lock and gently closed the door before I could respond. Jenna had this habit of doing yoga in our bedroom every morning, and one day in early December she came downstairs looking puzzled, saying she kept hearing these tiny clicking sounds while she was in downward dog, like someone tapping a pencil against wood but coming from below. Our bedroom was directly above Thomas's living area, and when we both went upstairs to listen, sure enough, there were these intermittent clicking noises, so faint you had to really concentrate to hear them. I figured maybe he had some kind of hobby, model building or something. People who work nights often have unusual ways to unwind, but Jenna started changing in the bathroom after that. Said she just felt weird about it, even though there was no logical reason. We also noticed our cat, Mango, absolutely refused to go near the basement door anymore. Would hiss and arch his back if we even carried him close to it, which was bizarre because he used to love sleeping on the warm spot where the heating vent came up through the floor there. The night everything went to hell started with me jerking awake at 2 in the morning to the sound of water rushing through the walls, that unmistakable whoosh that means a pipe has given way somewhere. I grabbed a flashlight and ran to the basement door, pounding on it and shouting for Thomas, but got no response, even though his car was in the driveway. The water was already seeping under the door into our hallway, and I could hear it spraying full force somewhere below. I threw my shoulder against the door hard. Once, twice, and on the 3rd hit the frame splintered, and the deadbolt ripped free from the wood. The basement was pitch black, and my flashlight beam caught the water first, cascading from a burst pipe in the ceiling, soaking everything. But as I swung the light around looking for the shutoff valve, I saw something that made my brain just stop processing for a second. The ceiling was covered in holes, dozens of them, each about the width of a quarter, drilled in precise patterns across the drywall. Some had thin cables snaking through them, others were plugged with what looked like small glass lenses, and all of them were positioned directly under the rooms where Jenna and I spent our time. My flashlight caught more details as I stood there in shock. A desk covered in monitors showing grainy green-tinted footage, boxes of electronic equipment I couldn't identify, and notebooks filled with handwritten schedules and observations. The monitors were still running on battery backup, and I could see our living room from above, our kitchen, and worst of all, our bedroom, all filmed from those tiny holes he'd so carefully hidden in the textured ceiling upstairs. One screen showed Jenna asleep in our bed at that very moment, and another had folders labeled with dates going back to the day Thomas moved in. I heard footsteps on the stairs behind me, and Thomas was suddenly there, not in work clothes but in dark athletic gear, his face completely different without the meek expression he usually wore, now sharp and focused and calculating. He didn't say anything, just looked at me, then at his equipment, then back at me, like he was doing math in his head about what would happen next. I started backing toward the door, keeping the flashlight aimed at his face, and told him the police were already on their way, which was a lie but seemed like the right thing to say. He smiled then, not the nervous smile I'd seen before, but something confident and practiced, and said in a voice much deeper than his usual whisper that I had no idea how many places he'd been, or how many people had thought they were safe in their own homes. Then he moved faster than I expected, not toward me, but to his desk, grabbing something before sprinting past me and up the stairs, shoving me hard into the wall as he went. By the time I got upstairs, Jenna was standing in the hallway with her phone, saying she'd heard the crash and already called 911, but Thomas was gone, the front door wide open and cold December air rushing in. His car was still in the driveway, which meant he'd fled on foot, probably had another vehicle stashed nearby or someone waiting to pick him up. The whole thing planned out like everything else he'd done. The police arrived within minutes, and I took them down to the basement, which was now ankle-deep in water from the still gushing pipe. But the equipment was still there, those monitors still glowing with their sick green light, showing every private moment we thought we'd had. The detective who specialized in these cases told us to pack some things and find somewhere else to stay for a few days while they processed the scene. Said Thomas had likely been recording everything for months, possibly selling the footage or just keeping it for his own twisted reasons. The investigation revealed things that still make me nauseous when I think about them, like how Thomas Brennan wasn't even his real name, just one of at least 6 identities they could trace. The detective showed us photos from other rental properties in Colorado and Wyoming, where similar setups had been found. Always basement apartments, always couples or single women living above, always the same pattern of holes drilled with surgical precision. They found receipt copies in his desk for specialty surveillance equipment, ordered to different addresses, some dating back 3 years, and a laptop with encrypted files the FBI tech team was still trying to crack. The worst part was learning from the neighbors that they'd seen someone matching his description at odd hours, sometimes just standing in our backyard at night, looking up at our windows, and they'd assumed it was just the tenant getting some air, nothing worth mentioning. We stayed in a hotel for a week while contractors repaired the water damage and patched all those holes, though knowing where each one had been still makes my skin itch when I walk through the house. Jenna couldn't sleep for months, would wake up checking the ceiling with her phone's flashlight, convinced she could hear that clicking sound again, even though Thomas was long gone. We had a security system installed, cameras covering every angle of the property, motion sensors, the whole deal, which felt ironic given what had happened, trading one form of surveillance for another. The detective called a few times with updates, said they'd connected Thomas to at least 12 similar cases across 4 states, but he'd vanished completely, probably using another identity they hadn't uncovered yet, maybe already setting up in another basement somewhere, drilling his neat little holes while some unsuspecting couple slept above him. 6 months later, I was grabbing coffee downtown when I swear I saw him across the street. Same height, same thinning hair, wearing those generic clothes meant to blend into any crowd. My whole body went rigid, and I stood there watching as he walked into a hardware store, probably buying more drill bits, more tiny cameras, more cables to snake through someone else's ceiling. I called the detective immediately, but by the time they arrived, the man was gone. And the store's security footage showed someone who looked similar, but not quite the same. Though the detective admitted these guys were experts at changing their appearance just enough to create doubt. We ended up selling the house 2 months after that. Took a loss on it, but didn't care. Just needed to be somewhere he'd never been. Somewhere without a basement. Somewhere we could shower and sleep and live without wondering what might be watching from inside the walls. The new buyers were a young family with kids, and I wanted to warn them, to tell them everything. But my lawyer said we'd disclosed what we legally had to, and anything more might be seen as trying to sabotage the sale. So I just handed over the keys and hoped they'd never need to find out why we'd installed so many locks. The conference in Seattle wasn't something I could skip, not with the promotion hanging in the balance and my boss watching every move I made. Hotels downtown were charging $300 a night minimum, which would have blown through my travel allowance in 2 days. So I scrolled through Airbnb until I found something reasonable. $60 a night for a whole house seemed too good to pass up, even if it meant a 40-minute drive to the convention center each morning. The listing showed a charming craftsman-style place with original hardwood floors and vintage fixtures, the kind of house my grandmother would have loved. The host, Martin, had stellar reviews, mostly from business travelers like me who praised his quick responses in the peaceful neighborhood. I booked 5 nights without hesitation, figuring I'd just need a clean bed and a hot shower after 12-hour days at the conference. Martin met me at the house on Sunday evening, right as the October rain started picking up. He was younger than I expected, maybe early 40s, with perfectly combed hair and clothes that looked like he'd ironed them twice. His handshake lasted a beat too long, and he maintained this intense eye contact while explaining the house rules, like he was trying to memorize my face. The place was exactly as advertised, maybe even nicer, with fresh flowers on the dining table and a welcome basket full of local coffee and snacks. He walked me through each room, pointing out the thermostat, the Wi-Fi password taped to the router, the extra towels in the linen closet. When we reached the hallway, he stopped at a white door near the kitchen and his whole demeanor shifted. His voice dropped lower, more serious, as he explained that this was the basement door, and it needed to stay locked at all times. Something about ongoing renovations, exposed wiring, insurance liability, the usual concerns that property owners have. He actually pulled on the handle to show me it was secured, then watched me nod in understanding before his smile returned. The first 2 nights passed without incident. I'd leave early for the conference, grabbing coffee from the kitchen while the house sat silent in the pre-dawn darkness, and return after 10 each night, too exhausted to do anything but shower and collapse into bed. The house had this settled quietness that old places develop, with the occasional creak of wood, adjusting to temperature changes, or pipes ticking behind the walls. On Monday night, I'd actually stood in the hallway eating takeout Chinese food, staring at that basement door while wondering what kind of renovation required such strict warnings. The door looked ancient, with layers of white paint that had yellowed at the edges, and an old-fashioned keyhole beneath the modern deadbolt Martin had installed. I even bent down once to peek through the keyhole, seeing nothing but black, before feeling ridiculous and heading to bed. Wednesday changed everything. The conference ended early due to a speaker cancellation, so I got back to the house around 6 instead of my usual 10:30. I decided to take advantage of the extra time, pouring myself wine from a bottle I'd bought and settling onto the couch with my laptop to review presentations. The house felt different in the evening light, more lived in somehow, like someone had just stepped out for groceries. Around 8, while I was deep in a spreadsheet, I heard this rhythmic creaking from somewhere below. My first thought was the washing machine, maybe on an automatic cycle, but Martin hadn't mentioned any appliances in the basement. The sound continued for maybe 10 minutes, steady and deliberate like footsteps pacing back and forth on old wooden stairs. I actually muted my laptop and pressed my ear to the floor, trying to locate the source, but the moment I did, the sound stopped completely, as if someone down there had heard me listening. I texted Martin about the noise, trying to keep it casual, asking if there was any automated equipment in the basement that might be running. He replied within seconds, which struck me as odd for 8 at night, saying it was probably just the old boiler system settling for the evening and apologizing if it disturbed my work. His response should have been reassuring, but the speed of it, like he'd been waiting for my message, made me uneasy. I went back to my spreadsheets, but concentration was impossible. Every small sound made me look up, and I found myself glancing repeatedly at that hallway where the basement door waited. Around 9, I heard what sounded like metal scraping against wood, just once. Brief but distinct. I grabbed my phone to text Martin again, but stopped, realizing how paranoid I'd sound complaining about every little noise in an old house. That night, I couldn't fall asleep. I lay in the darkness of the guest bedroom, listening to the house breathe around me, trying to separate normal settling sounds from anything else. Sometime after midnight, maybe closer to 1, I heard the definitive sound of footsteps beneath the floorboards. Not the random creaking of old wood, but a clear pattern. 7 steps one way, a pause, 7 steps back. The counting became automatic, something my brain did without permission, and with each repetition, the pause grew longer. During one of these pauses, I heard something that made me sit straight up in bed. The distinct sound of a doorknob turning, that specific metallic click and release. I knew immediately which door it was, even from the bedroom. My phone was in my hand before I'd made the conscious decision to grab it, thumb hovering over the emergency call button while I strained to hear what would come next. The footsteps that followed were different, heavier and more deliberate, moving through the hallway toward the living room. I could track them by the way different floorboards complained under the weight, each creak mapping out a path through the house I'd walked myself just hours earlier. They stopped near the couch where I'd been working, and I heard the unmistakable sound of papers rustling. My work documents were still spread across the coffee table, including contracts with my company's letterhead, my business cards, even my travel itinerary with my home address printed at the top. The silence that followed felt deliberate, like someone reading, absorbing information. Then came a sound that nearly made me call out, the wine glass I'd left on the table being picked up and set down again, the faint ring of glass meeting wood echoing in the darkness. I did the stupidest thing possible. I got out of bed and crept to the bedroom door, pressing my face against the wood to listen better. The living room was maybe 20 feet away, a straight shot down the hallway, and whoever was out there would only need to turn the corner to see my door. But I had to know if this was real or if I was having some kind of exhaustion-induced breakdown. My hand found the doorknob, turned it with excruciating slowness to avoid any sound, and I opened the door just enough to peer out with one eye. The hallway was dark, but streetlight from the living room windows created this dim gray twilight, enough to see shapes and shadows. And there, standing beside the coffee table with my papers in his hands, was Martin. He was wearing different clothes than when he'd met me on Sunday, a worn undershirt and sweatpants like he'd been sleeping. But what made me pull back and nearly gasp aloud was realizing he was barefoot, and his feet were dirty, covered in what looked like dust or soil, leaving faint prints on the hardwood floor. I closed the door with infinite care, turned the lock so slowly that it took nearly 30 seconds for the bolt to fully engage, then backed away until my legs hit the bed. My mind was racing through possibilities, each more insane than the last. Maybe he'd forgotten something important and had a spare key. Maybe there was an emergency. Maybe he was checking on the property. But none of that explained why he'd come through the basement or why he was going through my personal papers at 1 in the morning. I could hear him moving again, those dirty feet padding across the floor toward the kitchen. The refrigerator opened, stayed open for maybe a minute, then closed. Water ran in the sink. Normal sounds that became terrifying because they shouldn't be happening. I started recording video on my phone, not of him, but of the door crack where light might show movement, evidence that I wasn't imagining this. The next sound was worse than anything before. The squeak of weight settling onto the couch springs, like he was making himself comfortable in the living room. I could picture him out there, maybe still holding my papers, sitting in the dark just 30 feet from where I was hiding. My phone showed 1:47 a.m., and I made the decision to wait him out, to stay locked in this room until daylight, then get out and never come back. But around 2:30, after nearly an hour of silence, I heard him stand and walk back toward the hallway. The footsteps paused right outside my door, and I swear I could hear breathing. This slow, measured rhythm, like someone trying to detect signs of consciousness from within. My own breath stopped entirely, my whole body rigid under the covers where I dove the moment he'd started moving. The doorknob rattled once, just a gentle test, finding it locked. Then nothing for maybe 5 minutes. Absolute stillness before those footsteps retreated back toward the kitchen, and that basement door opened and closed with its familiar creak. I didn't sleep, not for 1 second. I sat on that bed with my back against the headboard, phone clutched in both hands, watching the door and listening to every sound the house made for the rest of the night. When gray dawn light finally crept through the curtains, I threw everything into my suitcase without folding anything, not caring about wrinkles or organization. I waited until 6:30, when the neighborhood would have people heading to work, witnesses around if something went wrong, then unlocked my door and walked straight to my car without looking anywhere but forward. Before driving away, though, I had to know. I walked around the back of the house, my keys gripped between my fingers like claws, until I found it. A storm door cellar entrance, the kind with angled metal doors that lead from outside directly into the basement. The padlock that should have secured it was hanging open, and there were fresh scrape marks in the dirt, where the doors had been repeatedly opened. The grass around it was worn down to bare earth in a rough path that led to a cluster of trees where the property line ended. When the police searched the basement 3 hours later, after I'd called them from a Starbucks parking lot 10 miles away, they found a makeshift living space behind the boiler. A sleeping bag, camp stove, boxes of canned food, and a milk crate full of items taken from previous guests. A watch, several driver's licenses, pieces of jewelry, phone chargers, even underwear. Martin had been living down there for months, they said, entering through that outside entrance and moving through the house at night while guests slept above him. The detective who called me later said they'd found notebooks where he'd written detailed observations about each guest, what time they went to bed, their daily routines, phone conversations he'd overheard through the floorboards. My name was already there, along with notes about my conference schedule and a sketch of my face that was disturbingly accurate. They arrested him at his actual apartment across town, where he'd been maintaining the appearance of a normal life while essentially living beneath his rental property, surfacing at night like some kind of human rodent to study the people who'd paid him to feel safe. There are nights when silence feels heavier than usual, like the whole house is waiting for something to happen. I remember one of those nights vividly, mostly because it started out so ordinary. I had just come home after another long evening shift at the diner where I worked. My routine was always the same: drop my keys on the counter, kick off my shoes, and heat up whatever leftovers were still in the fridge. That night, though, when I walked through the kitchen, I noticed a faint glow coming from the hallway that led to the basement door. The light was on down there, which didn't make sense. I never used the basement except to store tools and boxes that hadn't been touched in years. At first, I laughed it off, thinking I must have flipped the switch by accident one morning when I was half awake. Still, something about that dim yellow light spilling under the door made me uneasy. The basement always had this strange, still air about it, like time stopped at the bottom of those steps. I opened the door and stood there for a moment, trying to convince myself I was just being ridiculous. The bulb buzzed faintly, casting long shadows over the concrete floor. I almost turned it off right then, but curiosity got the better of me. When I went down, I noticed how thick the dust layer had gotten since the last time I'd been there. You could see every small print from mice, the outline of old pipes, and my own footprints from months ago. Near the far wall, close to the furnace, I spotted something new. A few half-formed boot prints, much larger than my own. The shape was distinct, almost recent, like someone had walked there not long ago and disturbed the dust just enough to leave a clear mark. I told myself maybe the plumber had left them when he came by earlier that year, but deep down, I knew he never walked that far in. That image of those footprints stuck with me the rest of the night. I went back upstairs, double-checked every lock, and tried to sleep with the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. But around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a faint metallic sound echoing through the vents, like something lightly brushing against the inside of the ducts. Came again, slower this time, followed by a hollow tap that seemed to move across the house. I stared at the ceiling, counting each sound, pretending it was just the heating system settling. But the truth was, I had never heard those noises before. The next morning, I checked the basement again, hoping to find something that would make sense of the noise. Everything looked the same cold air, same quiet hum from the furnace. Still, I could not stop staring at those footprints. I knelt down, touched the dust, and realized the top layer seemed freshly disturbed again, like someone had stepped there after I had gone upstairs. I told myself it must have been airflow from the vents, or maybe a small animal. But that explanation did not sit right. The house was sealed up tight, and I had not seen a single mouse in years. 2 nights later, the metallic sounds returned, sharper this time. They moved from one vent to another, like something crawling through the ductwork. Then came a faint whiff of cigarette smoke. It was so subtle that I almost ignored it, but the smell lingered long enough for me to notice where it came from, the vent near my bed. I sat there for what felt like an hour, just listening. The furnace was off. The house was still. But that smell, cheap, acrid tobacco, seeped out from below, mixing with the stale air of my room. I could not remember the last time anyone had smoked inside this house. I barely slept that night, and when dawn came, I decided to check the basement again. The air down there was heavier, colder, and the smell of smoke was stronger. I noticed a few ashes on the concrete near the furnace, tiny gray flakes scattered close to the vent opening. That was when I noticed something odd behind the furnace. There was a narrow panel of metal, slightly misaligned. When I crouched and looked closer, I realized it was not part of the furnace at all, but a piece of sheet metal wedged over a small opening in the wall. Behind it, a dark void stretched deeper than I could see. I hesitated before pulling it aside. The sound of my own breathing filled the room. When I finally shifted the metal enough to look inside, a faint draft hit my face, cool and stale. The crawl space was cramped and uneven, with old insulation hanging like cobwebs. I shined my phone's flashlight in and saw a few things that made my chest tighten. A crumpled blanket, an empty can of beans, and a half-burned cigarette resting on a brick. Someone had been staying down there, watching, listening. I backed away slowly, not sure what to do next. I stood there, gripping the edge of the furnace, trying to wrap my head around what I was seeing. It was not just that someone had been living down there, it was that they had been close enough to hear everything I did. Every step, every door opening, every phone call. I thought about the faint sounds I'd brushed off for weeks. It all fit together now in the worst possible way. The vent outside must have been their entrance, hidden behind the shrubs near the side of the house. I never noticed it before because I hardly went back there. I backed away and called the police, my voice trembling as I tried to explain. The dispatcher told me to wait outside until officers arrived. Standing in the driveway, I could see the faint glow of my basement light through the small window near the ground. It was strange, knowing that someone might still be in there, maybe watching me from the shadows. When the officers finally arrived, they went inside with flashlights and weapons drawn. I heard one of them yell something, followed by the sound of boots pounding against the floor. They pulled out a man who looked like he had not slept in days. His clothes were filthy, and his eyes darted around like a cornered animal's. The officers said he had been sneaking in at night through the vent, hiding in that crawl space whenever I was home. There were food wrappers, cigarette butts, and even a small radio tuned to static. He had made himself comfortable in my walls, using the ducts to listen to me move from room to room. The realization made my chest feel hollow. I had been living above him, completely unaware, for who knows how long. After they took him away, I had every vent sealed and the crawl space welded shut. The house felt different after that. Quieter, but not in a peaceful way. Sometimes late at night, I still catch myself glancing toward the basement door, half expecting to see that faint yellow light seeping out again. It has been months since it happened, but I cannot shake the feeling that the silence in this house is not empty anymore. It feels like it is waiting, listening, just like he once did. January in northern Minnesota means one thing to folks like me: ice fishing season. My buddies from the warehouse where I load trucks had been talking about Lake Winnibigoshish for weeks, planning a group trip that kept getting postponed. But that Saturday morning, after my divorce papers finally came through, 10 years of marriage reduced to a manila envelope, I decided I needed to go alone. 34 felt ancient that day, watching my breath fog up the windshield of my Ford F-150 as I pulled into the empty parking area near the public access point around 6 in the morning. The lake stretched out like a white desert, perfectly still, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I had been ice fishing since my father first took me out when I was 7 years old, so I knew what I was doing. At least, I thought I did. The forecast had promised clear skies and temperatures hovering around 15 degrees. Cold, but manageable for a full day on the ice. I hauled my portable shanty, my auger, and my bucket of gear about 300 yards out from shore, past the clusters of permanent fish houses that dotted the area closer to land. I wanted solitude, needed it really, and the spot I chose sat isolated near a point where the walleye liked to congregate in the deeper water. By 7:30, I had drilled my holes, set up my shelter, and dropped my first line. The ice beneath my feet felt solid, maybe 10 inches thick based on the shavings from the auger. I remember thinking how therapeutic it was out there, just me in the cold and the rhythmic bobbing of my rod tip. No lawyers, no arguments about who gets the house, no watching my wife, ex-wife now, pack her things into boxes. Just ice, water, and fish. Around 11, the wind started picking up from the northwest. Nothing alarming at first, just steady gusts that made my shanty walls ripple and snap. I stepped outside to check on my tip-ups, those little flag rigs I had set about 20 yards away in a scattered pattern. The sky had changed while I was inside, gone from that crisp winter blue to a pale gray that seemed to press down on everything. I noticed the permanent fish houses in the distance looked smaller somehow, farther away than I remembered. Chalked it up to the flat light playing tricks, the way everything on a frozen lake can look distorted when the clouds roll in. I grabbed a thermos of coffee from my sled and poured myself a cup, watching the steam curl and vanish in the cold air. A few other trucks had arrived at the parking area. I could see their tiny shapes near the shore, but nobody had ventured out this far. That should have been my first clue that something was wrong. I was reeling in a small perch, maybe 6 inches long, when I heard it. A deep, resonant groan that seemed to come from everywhere at once, vibrating up through my boots and into my chest. Ice makes noise all the time, especially on big lakes. It expands and contracts, creates these eerie sounds that newcomers find terrifying, but veterans learn to ignore. But this sound was different. It was followed by a sharp crack like a rifle shot, somewhere behind me toward the north. I set down my rod and walked to the edge of my fishing area, scanning the white expanse. That is when I noticed my tackle box had moved. Not fallen over, not knocked by wind. It had slid about 3 feet to my left, leaving a faint scrape mark on the ice surface. I stood there staring at it, my brain trying to process what I was seeing. Then I felt it beneath my boots, a subtle, sickening tilt, like standing on a boat that had just caught a wave. I dropped to my knees and pressed my bare palm against the ice, feeling for movement. The surface was wet, slick with a thin film of water that had not been there an hour ago. My heart started hammering as I scrambled toward the direction of shore. or what I thought was shore. That is when I saw it clearly for the first time. A jagged black line cutting across the white maybe 40 feet ahead of me, stretching in both directions as far as I could see. Open water. The crack had separated my section of ice from the main sheet, and the wind was pushing me, pushing the entire frozen platform I stood on, slowly but steadily toward the center of Lake Winnebagoshish. I ran back to my shanty and grabbed my phone from my jacket pocket. No signal. Of course no signal. I was in the middle of nowhere, Minnesota, and the nearest cell tower was probably 15 miles away. I tried anyway, holding the phone up toward the gray sky like that would somehow help, watching those empty bars mock me while the ice beneath my feet continued its slow, terrible drift. The gap of open water was widening. What had been maybe 3 feet across when I first spotted, it was now closer to 8 or 10, the dark water churning with small chunks of broken ice. I thought about jumping it, making a run and leaping across before it got any wider. But the edge of my ice floe was jagged and unstable, pieces crumbling off into the water even as I watched. One wrong step, one miscalculation, and I would plunge into 30-degree water wearing heavy winter gear. Hypothermia would set in within minutes. I had read somewhere that you have about 10 minutes of meaningful movement in water, that cold before your muscles stop responding, and maybe an hour before your core temperature drops enough to kill you. The shore looked impossibly far now. A thin, dark line on the horizon interrupted by the colorful dots of those fish houses I had passed earlier. I screamed for help, cupping my hands around my mouth and shouting until my throat burned. The wind swallowed every sound, carrying my voice away into nothing. I forced myself to stop panicking and think. My father had taught me that panic kills faster than cold ever could, that your brain is your best survival tool if you keep it working. I took inventory of what I had. The portable shanty, my auger, a sled with fishing gear, about 50 feet of rope, a small propane heater, some hand warmers, a half-eaten sandwich, and the thermos of coffee that was now barely lukewarm. No flares, no emergency beacon, nothing designed for this exact nightmare scenario. The ice floe I stood on was roughly the size of a basketball court, maybe a little bigger, and I could feel it rotating slowly as the wind and current fought over which direction to push it. I checked my watch, 12:47 in the afternoon. Sunset would come around 5, and after that the temperature would plummet from uncomfortable to deadly. I had maybe 4 hours to figure something out before darkness made everything worse. The gray clouds overhead had thickened, and I caught the smell of snow in the air, that particular metallic scent that anyone who has lived through northern winters learns to recognize. I decided my best chance was to make myself visible. I collapsed the shanty and spread the bright orange fabric flat on the ice, weighing down the corners with my tackle box, the auger, and chunks of ice I stomped loose from the edge. From the air, it might look like a distress signal. From shore, if anyone was watching through binoculars, they might notice something wrong. I kept checking my phone obsessively, walking to different spots on the floe hoping to catch a single bar of signal, but the screen stayed empty. The water gap between me and the main ice sheet was now at least 30 feet wide, a river of black that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. I could see that the ice I stood on was not uniform. Some sections were thick and white, others darker and thinner where the current had worn them down from beneath. I started mapping the safe zones in my head, staying near the center where the ice felt most solid, avoiding the edges where cracks spiderwebbed out with every gust of wind. Around 2 in the afternoon, the first piece broke off. I heard it before I saw it, a grinding, tearing sound like bones snapping. And then a chunk the size of a dining room table simply tilted and slid into the water on the north side of the floe. I watched it bob for a moment before the current pulled it under, gone in seconds. My territory was shrinking. I moved everything toward the center, piling my gear into a tight cluster around me, and lit the propane heater even though I knew I should save the fuel. My fingers had gone numb inside my gloves, and I needed to keep my core temperature up if I was going to survive long enough for someone to notice I was missing. The problem was that nobody would notice. My co-workers thought I was sulking at home after the divorce. My ex-wife certainly was not going to check on me. My parents lived in Florida now, retired, and we only talked on Sundays. I had told no one where I was going, had not filed any kind of trip plan, had just driven out here in a fog of self-pity and dropped myself into the middle of a frozen lake like an idiot. The snow started falling around 2:30, fat wet flakes that cut visibility down to maybe 100 yards. I could no longer see the shore at all, just white in every direction, the sky and the ice merging into a featureless void. The flow had drifted far enough that the water gap was now impossible to gauge. It could have been 50 feet or 500. I huddled next to the heater, wrapped in the collapsed shanty fabric for extra insulation, and tried to calculate my odds. Even if someone noticed my truck in the parking lot by nightfall, they would not know where to look. The lake covered over 60,000 acres, and I could be anywhere on it by now. Search and rescue would need boats, maybe helicopters, and in this weather they might not even be able to launch until morning. I thought about my father. How disappointed he would be if he knew I had gotten myself into this situation through carelessness. He had always said the lake does not forgive mistakes, that you have to respect it every single time you step onto the ice. I had not respected it today. I had been too wrapped up in my own misery to pay attention to the warning signs that must have been there all along. The light was fading when I heard the engine. At first I thought I was hallucinating, my desperate brain inventing sounds to give me hope. But it grew louder, a distinct mechanical whine cutting through the wind, and I scrambled to my feet so fast I nearly slipped on the wet ice. I grabbed the orange shanty fabric and started waving it over my head, screaming words that made no sense, just noise, just anything to be heard. Through the snow I saw it, a single headlight bouncing across the frozen surface, an airboat moving fast from the southeast. Someone had seen my truck. Or maybe spotted the orange fabric before the snow got too heavy. Or maybe it was just pure dumb luck that a conservation officer was doing a routine patrol. The boat circled wide around my shrinking island of ice, the pilot assessing the situation. And then a voice crackled through a loudspeaker telling me to stay calm, stay centered, do not move toward the edge. They threw a rope on the third try, a thick yellow line that landed 5 feet from where I stood. I tied it around my waist with fingers that barely worked anymore, and they pulled me across the gap, dragging me over the unstable edge and through 6 feet of freezing water before hauling me onto the airboat deck like a caught fish. The officer, a woman named Colleen with a weathered face and no patience for small talk, wrapped me in thermal blankets and cranked the boat's heater to maximum. She told me I was lucky, that another hour and the flow would have broken apart completely, that hypothermia was already setting in based on how badly I was shivering. My core temperature had dropped to 94 degrees by the time we reached shore and the waiting ambulance. I spent 2 nights in the hospital in Bemidji, recovering from mild frostbite on 3 fingers and the kind of exhaustion that goes deeper than muscles. The doctors said I came within maybe 40 minutes of a very different outcome. I think about that number a lot now, 40 minutes between being here and being a body they would find when the ice melted in spring. I sold my fishing gear that summer, gave away the shanty, the auger, all of it. Some people told me I should get back out there, that you cannot let fear win, but they did not understand. It was not fear that kept me away. It was respect, the kind my father always talked about, the kind I finally learned the hard way on a Saturday in January when the ice decided to remind me that nature does not care about your problems, your divorce, your sadness. It just does what it does, and you either pay attention or you pay the price. Anyone who has lived through a real blizzard knows the silence that comes with it. That heavy, muffled quiet that makes you feel buried alive even inside your own home. I had been living in my grandmother's old farmhouse in rural Wisconsin for about 8 months when the worst storm in 15 years decided to roll through. She had passed away the previous spring, leaving me the property in her will, and I took it as a sign to start over after my marriage fell apart. My high school graduating class had their 10-year reunion that same year, which should tell you roughly where I was in life. Old enough to know better, young enough to still make stupid decisions. The house sat at the end of a 2-mile private road, surrounded by nothing but frozen cornfields and dense pine forest. My nearest neighbor, an elderly farmer named Walt Hubbard, lived so far away that I could scream at the top of my lungs and nobody would ever hear me. That thought had never bothered me before. The isolation was the whole point. I wanted to disappear for a while, to figure out who I was without a husband defining my every move. But when the National Weather Service issued a severe blizzard warning that Monday morning, predicting up to 3 feet of snow and dangerous wind chills, I started to feel the weight of just how alone I really was. I spent that morning making sure I was prepared for the worst. The pantry was stocked with canned goods, pasta, rice, and enough bottled water to last a month. I had filled the bathtub as a backup water supply, a trick my grandmother taught me when I was a girl visiting her during winter breaks. The wood stove in the living room was my primary heat source, and I had been splitting and stacking firewood since October, so I knew I could stay warm even if the power went out for a week. By early afternoon, the sky had turned that sickly greenish-gray color that always precedes something bad, and the first flakes started drifting down around 2. Within 3 hours, I could barely see the old tool shed that stood about 40 yards from the back of the house, just a dark smudge in a world that had gone completely white. The wind picked up around 5, howling through the gaps in the window frames, making the whole house shudder like it was trying to shake itself apart. I made myself a simple dinner of tomato soup and grilled cheese, ate it curled up on the couch by the fire, and tried to convince myself that everything was fine. I was safe. I was prepared. Nothing could touch me out here. Then, just after 7, I heard something that made every muscle in my body go rigid. A weak, desperate knock at my front door. For a long moment, I did not move. I sat there on the couch with my empty soup bowl in my lap, staring at the door like it had suddenly grown teeth. Nobody came out here. Nobody. The mail carrier did not even attempt my road in winter. I had a P.O. box in town for that reason. Walt Hubbard was 83 years old and had told me explicitly that he did not leave his house between December and March unless someone was dying. The knock came again, louder this time, more frantic, and I heard something else beneath the howling wind. A voice. A woman's voice, high and thin and trembling. I set the bowl down on the coffee table and stood up slowly, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The voice came again, clearer now, and I could make out the words, "Please, please help me. Please let me in." There was something raw in it, something that sounded like genuine terror. I walked toward the door on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, and I pressed my eye to the small window set into the upper panel. What I saw made me take a sharp breath. A young woman stood on my porch, and she was dressed in nothing but a thin sweater and jeans. No coat, no hat, no gloves. Her arms were wrapped around herself, and even through the frost-covered glass, I could see her whole body shaking violently. She looked maybe 22 or 23, with dark hair plastered to her face by snow and wind, and her skin had taken on that waxy bluish tint that comes with serious cold exposure. She saw me looking and her face crumpled with relief, tears cutting tracks through the snow on her cheeks. "Oh, thank God," she sobbed, pressing her palms flat against the door. "Please, you have to help me. He's going to kill me. Please." I ran. I didn't know where else to go. "Please just let me inside." Her words tumbled out in a desperate rush, and I found myself reaching for the deadbolt before I even realized what I was doing. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to help this girl, to get her warm, to save her from whatever nightmare she had escaped. My fingers touched the cold metal of the lock, and then the wind shifted direction, and I saw them. The tool shed sat about 40 yards from the back corner of the house, a squat wooden structure my grandfather had built sometime in the 70s. For most of the evening, it had been nothing but a gray blur in the storm. But when the wind changed, pushing the snow sideways instead of straight down, I got a clear view of the yard for maybe 3 or 4 seconds. That was enough. 2 figures stood behind the shed, partially hidden by its bulk, and they were watching the house. They were not moving, not trying to get to shelter. not doing anything a normal person would do in a blizzard. They were just standing there in the dark, still as statues, their attention fixed on the porch where the young woman was begging me to open the door. I could not make out their faces. They were too far away, and the light was too dim. But I could see their silhouettes clearly against the white snow. Both of them were large, broad-shouldered, wearing dark winter clothing. One of them was holding something long and thin in his right hand. The wind shifted again and they vanished behind the curtain of snow. But I knew what I had seen. I jerked my hand away from the deadbolt like it had burned me. The woman on the porch was still crying, still pleading, her voice cracking with what sounded like absolute desperation. "Please, I'm begging you, I'm going to die out here. He broke my phone, I couldn't call anyone, I just ran. Please, please, I have nowhere else to go." She slammed her palm against the door and I flinched backward, nearly tripping over the edge of the rug. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Maybe they were other victims. Maybe they had escaped with her and were too afraid to approach the house. Maybe I was being paranoid and they were just neighbors I did not know about, checking on properties during the storm. But none of that explained why they were hiding. None of that explained why they were watching instead of helping. And none of that explained the way the young woman's eyes kept darting to the side, toward the corner of the house, like she was checking on something, or someone. I backed further into the living room, my hand finding the back of the couch for support. "I'm going to call the police," I said, loud enough for her to hear through the door. "They can come help you. Just stay there and I'll get help coming." What happened next is something I will never forget as long as I live. The crying stopped. It did not taper off, did not fade into sniffles or quiet sobs. It just stopped, like someone had flipped a switch. For a moment there was nothing but the sound of the wind and the crackling of the fire behind me. Then the woman spoke again, and her voice was completely different. Gone was the trembling, the desperation, the raw terror. What replaced it was flat, calm, almost bored. "That's not going to work," she said. The words came out slow and deliberate, like she was explaining something simple to a child who was not quite getting it. I stood frozen in the middle of my living room, staring at the door, trying to reconcile what I was hearing with the broken, sobbing girl I had seen just seconds ago. She was not even pretending anymore. Through the small window I could see her face had changed too. The crumpled expression of fear had smoothed out into something blank and patient. She tilted her head slightly, like a dog hearing a strange sound, and looked directly at the window where she knew I was watching. "The phone lines are down," she said, that terrible flat voice cutting through the storm. "Cell service has been out for hours. Nobody is coming to help you." My phone was on the kitchen counter. I had not checked it in over an hour, maybe longer. I wanted to run to it to prove her wrong, but I could not make myself move. I could not look away from her face in that window, from the way she was staring at me with an expression that held nothing. No anger, no frustration, no emotion at all. It was like looking at a mask made of skin. "You should have just opened the door," she said, and something in her tone made it sound almost like a genuine piece of advice, like she was sorry I had made the wrong choice. "It would have been faster." Then she turned her head toward the back of the house, toward where I had seen those two figures hiding, and she nodded. Just once. A small, quick motion that meant everything and confirmed every horrible suspicion screaming through my brain. I heard footsteps then, heavy, crunching footsteps in the snow coming from the side of the house, coming from the direction of the back door. I finally broke free of whatever paralysis had gripped me and ran for the kitchen, praying that I had remembered to lock the back entrance, praying that the deadbolt would hold, praying that this was all some horrible nightmare I would wake up from any second now. The back door was locked. I reached it just as a shadow passed across the small window set into its upper half, and I slammed my palm against the deadbolt to make sure it was fully engaged. It was an old door, solid oak that my grandfather had hung himself decades ago, but the frame around it was original to the house, over 100 years old, and not nearly as sturdy as I would have liked. I grabbed my phone from the counter with trembling fingers and looked at the screen. No signal. She had been telling the truth about that much. The landline was in the living room, a corded phone my grandmother had never gotten rid of, and I ran back to grab it. Dead. Nothing but empty silence when I pressed it to my ear. They had cut the line somewhere outside, probably hours ago. Probably while I was eating dinner and feeling safe and congratulating myself on being so well prepared. A loud thump against the back door made me spin around, and I heard a man's voice for the first time, low and rough, muffled by the wood. "Open up," he said. No desperation, no fake story, no pretense at all. Just a simple command, like he expected to be obeyed. Another thump, harder this time, and I saw the door shudder in its frame. I needed a weapon. The thought cut through my panic like a blade, sharp and clear. I needed something to defend myself because these people were getting into my house one way or another, and I was not going to make it easy for them. My grandmother had kept a shotgun in the hall closet, a 12-gauge Remington that she used to scare off coyotes when they got too close to her chicken coop. I had never fired it myself, but I had watched her do it enough times, and I knew it was loaded. She always kept it loaded, said an unloaded gun was about as useful as a chocolate teapot. I ran to the closet and yanked open the door, my eyes scanning the dark interior, until I found the familiar wooden stock leaning in the corner. I grabbed it, checked that the safety was off the way I had seen her do 100 times, and positioned myself in the hallway where I could see both the front and back doors. The thumping on the back door had stopped, and for a moment the only sound was the wind and my own ragged breathing. Then I heard something worse, the sharp, splintering crack of wood coming from the direction of the mudroom, the small side entrance I had almost forgotten existed. They had found the weakest point. The mudroom door was flimsy, a cheap, hollow core thing that the previous owner had installed sometime in the 90s. I had been meaning to replace it ever since I moved in, had even priced out solid wood doors at the hardware store in town. But I kept putting it off because winter was coming, and I had 100 other things to worry about. Now that decision was going to get me killed. I heard another crack, louder this time, and the sound of something heavy hitting the door again and again. I raised the shotgun and pointed it at the mudroom entrance, trying to keep my arms steady, trying to remember everything my grandmother had taught me. She used to say that the sound of a shotgun being racked was enough to stop most trouble before it started. I did it now, that distinctive chunk echoing through the hallway, and I screamed at the top of my lungs, "I have a gun! I will shoot you! Get away from my house!" For a moment, everything went quiet. The banging stopped. The wind seemed to hold its breath. I stood there in the hallway, the shotgun growing heavy in my grip, sweat dripping down my temples despite the cold. And I waited. 5 seconds. 10. 15. Then I heard something that almost made my knees buckle. The woman's voice coming from right outside the mudroom door, close enough that she must have moved from the front porch while I was distracted. "She's got a gun," she called out, that same flat tone carrying through the damaged wood. "Remington looks like a 12-gauge. Silence again. I could hear them communicating somehow, low murmurs, barely audible over the storm, and then footsteps moving away from the mudroom, moving toward the back of the house, moving toward something I could not see. I did not know if they were retreating or regrouping, and I was too terrified to move from my position in the hallway. Minutes passed. Maybe 5, maybe 20. I lost all sense of time, standing there with the gun raised, my shoulders screaming in protest, my eyes burning from not blinking. The wind continued to howl. The fire in the wood stove crackled and popped. And then, slowly, I became aware of a new sound, an engine. Faint at first, then growing louder, accompanied by the crunch of tires on snow. Headlights swept across the front window, and I heard a vehicle door slam, then another, then a man's voice shouting something I could not make out. I did not lower the gun. I did not move. I just stood there shaking, until I heard a knock at the front door. A firm, authoritative knock followed by the words I had been praying for. "County Sheriff, ma'am. We got a call about a possible break-in at this address. Are you all right in there?" It took me a long moment to respond because I could not understand how they had gotten a call when all my lines were dead. I kept the gun raised and moved slowly toward the front door, checking the window to confirm what I was seeing. 2 uniformed deputies standing on my porch, a county patrol vehicle parked in the driveway with its lights flashing blue and red against the white snow. "How did you know?" I managed to croak out, my voice barely recognizable as my own. The older deputy, a heavy-set man with a gray mustache, leaned closer to the door. "Your neighbor called it in, ma'am. Walt Hubbard. Said he saw headlights coming down your road earlier this evening. A vehicle he didn't recognize. Said it didn't sit right with him, so he kept watching with his binoculars. When he saw people moving around your property on foot, he called us right away. Took us a while to get here with the roads being what they are. I finally lowered the shotgun and opened the door with numb fingers, and I must have looked like a complete wreck, because both deputies immediately stepped inside and started asking if I was hurt. I told them everything. The woman, the crying, the 2 figures behind the shed, the way her voice changed, the mudroom door. They searched the property with flashlights and found footprints everywhere, already filling with fresh snow. The mudroom door was hanging off one hinge, the frame cracked and splintered, where someone had been kicking it in. They found tire tracks at the end of my driveway, heading back toward the main road, but the snow was coming down so hard that any hope of following them was gone within minutes. The deputies stayed with me until morning, taking turns keeping watch while the other one dozed in the armchair by the fire. When the storm finally broke around dawn, more officers arrived, along with a detective from the county seat who asked me to go through my story 3 more times. They never caught the people who tried to break into my house that night. The detective told me later that this kind of thing, using a young woman as bait to get homeowners to open their doors, had been reported in a few other rural areas over the past year, always during severe weather, always targeting isolated properties. He said I was lucky. He said most people would have opened that door without thinking twice. I sold my grandmother's house 6 weeks later and moved back to the city, to an apartment building with a doorman and security cameras and neighbors on every side. Some nights I still dream about that woman's face in the window, the way it changed from desperate to empty in the span of a single breath. And I think about Walt Hubbard, 83 years old and watching the road with his binoculars during a blizzard, calling the sheriff because something just did not look right. I sent him a bottle of good whiskey and a thank you card before I left town. I do not know if he understood that he saved my life that night, but I will never forget it. I will never forget any of it. February of 2022 found me 6 months into what my divorce lawyer called the healing chapter, and what I called exile. 34 felt ancient when you were starting completely over, selling the house in Portland, taking a remote position with a software company, and moving into a farmhouse rental in rural Vermont that cost less per month than my old car payment. The property sat on 11 acres of nothing but birch trees and silence. The nearest neighbor, a dairy farmer named Gus Whitmore, who lived about 2 miles down Hadley Road. I had wanted isolation. I had wanted to hear myself think again after 3 years of arguments and accusations and slamming doors. My golden retriever, Penny, was the only company I needed, or so I told myself during those long winter nights when the wind screamed through the valley and the old radiators clanked like someone was trapped inside them. I had grown used to the sounds of that house, the way the floorboards groaned when the temperature dropped, the way ice would crack and pop against the windows like knuckles tapping glass. I thought I understood that place. I thought I knew every noise it could make. Wednesday started like any other day that week. Gray sky, coffee that never got hot enough, and a work call at 9 where my camera stayed off because I had not brushed my hair in 2 days. The weather report mentioned a storm rolling in from Canada. Nothing unusual for February in that part of the country, so I made sure I had enough firewood stacked on the porch and checked that the generator had fuel. By noon, the snow had started falling in thick curtains that erased the tree line within an hour. I remember standing at the kitchen window with Penny pressed against my leg, watching the world outside turn white and formless, feeling that particular kind of peace that comes from knowing you cannot go anywhere and no one can reach you. Around 3 in the afternoon, the power went out with a soft click, and the house settled into that heavy silence that always follows when the electrical hum disappears. I lit candles, started a fire in the wood stove, and felt almost grateful for the excuse to unplug completely. Then my phone buzzed with an emergency alert, and that fragile sense of peace shattered like ice under a boot heel. The message was brief and clinical in that way government warnings always are. An inmate had escaped during a transport accident on Route 12, approximately 9 miles from my location. The man's name was Carl Eugene Vickers, 41 years old, serving 18 years for aggravated assault and armed robbery. He was considered dangerous, possibly armed, last seen heading northwest into the Green Mountain National Forest, which meant he was heading directly toward the stretch of wilderness that bordered my property. Residents were advised to lock all doors and windows, report any suspicious activity, and avoid going outside until further notice. I read the alert 3 times, standing in my dim kitchen with the wood stove crackling behind me and the snow piling against the windows. 9 miles was not that far. In good weather, someone determined could cover that distance in a few hours. But in a whiteout blizzard with temperatures dropping below 0, surely no one could survive long enough to make it this far. That is what I told myself as I double-checked the deadbolt on the front door and wedged a chair under the handle of the back door that led to the mudroom. Surely the cold would stop him before anything else could. I tried to keep busy as the afternoon bled into evening. I fed Penny, heated soup on the wood stove, and read by candlelight while the storm howled outside like something wounded and furious. Every few minutes I would check my phone for updates, but the signal was weak and getting weaker, the screen showing one flickering bar that disappeared entirely by 6. The isolation that had felt like freedom that morning now pressed against me from all sides, heavy and suffocating. I found myself listening to the house in a way I never had before, cataloging each creak and groan, trying to separate the familiar sounds from anything that might be new. The wind threw snow against the north-facing windows in waves, and sometimes I could swear I heard footsteps on the porch beneath that noise, a rhythmic crunching that would start and stop and start again. But when I pulled back the curtain and held a candle to the glass, I saw nothing but white. Just the storm, I told myself. Just branches falling, just the old house settling in the cold. Penny lay by the wood stove with her head on her paws, watching me pace with those calm brown eyes, and I remember thinking that if she was not worried, then I should not be either. That changed around 9. I had just added another log to the fire and was settling into the armchair with a blanket when Penny lifted her head suddenly, ears pricked forward, body going rigid in that way dogs do when they hear something humans cannot. She stared at the floor, not at the door or the windows, but at the floor, specifically at the old heating vent near the baseboard where the previous owners had installed some kind of grated cover. A low growl started in her throat, so quiet at first that I thought I was imagining it, then building into something I had never heard from her before. Penny was the gentlest dog I had ever owned, the kind who greeted strangers with a wagging tail, and had never shown aggression toward anything except the vacuum cleaner. But now she was growling at that vent with her lips pulled back from her teeth, hackles raised along her spine like a ridge of dark fur. I sat frozen in the chair, watching her, my heart suddenly pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples. She would not look away from that vent. And then, beneath the sound of the wind and the crackling fire, I heard it too. A scraping noise, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere below the house. The farmhouse had a basement that I never used. The previous tenant had warned me about it when I signed the lease, said the stairs were rotted and the space was prone to flooding in the spring. I had gone down there exactly once in those first weeks after moving in, and found nothing but crumbling stone walls, a dirt floor, and the kind of darkness that seemed to swallow my flashlight beam whole. There were 2 ways in, an interior door in the hallway that I kept padlocked from my side, and a set of exterior cellar doors on the east side of the house that opened outward from ground level. Those cellar doors had a heavy iron latch on the inside, plus a security grate that the landlord had installed years ago after a break-in at another property he owned. I had checked that grate when I moved in, tugged on it to make sure it was solid, and then mostly forgotten it existed. But now, sitting in my candlelit living room with my dog growling at the floor, I thought about that basement with a clarity that bordered on panic. I thought about how the exterior doors were buried under snow. I thought about how the interior door was only 15 feet down the hallway from where I sat. And I thought about the sound I had just heard. That scraping, like something being dragged across stone. I did not sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, Penny would growl again, and I would snap back to full alertness, straining to hear whatever she was hearing. The sounds from the basement came and went in irregular intervals, sometimes silence for 20 or 30 minutes, then a sudden thump or scrape that made both of us jump. Around midnight, I heard something new, a metallic clinking, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone tapping a wrench against iron bars. I knew exactly what that sound was. It was the security grate. Someone was down there, testing the grate, trying to find a weakness in the metal. I grabbed my phone and tried to dial 911, but the screen just showed no service in that cruel little font, and I wanted to scream at it, wanted to throw it against the wall. The landline was dead too. The storm must have taken down the lines along with the power. I was completely cut off, alone in this house with my dog and a locked door and whatever was making those sounds 15 feet away. I thought about running, just grabbing Penny and bolting out the front door into the blizzard. But the snow was piled 3 feet high against the porch, and the temperature had dropped to -15. I would freeze to death before I made it halfway to Gus Whitmore's farm. So I waited. I sat in that armchair with a kitchen knife across my lap and a cast iron skillet within arm's reach, watching the hallway, watching Penny, listening to the sounds from below. The clinking continued for what felt like hours, sometimes fast and frantic, sometimes slow and methodical. I tried to picture what was happening down there. A man in the dark, hands numb from cold, working at the bolts that held the grate in place, desperate to get inside where it was warm. The image was so vivid I could almost see him, could almost smell the sweat and fear and frozen desperation. Every few minutes, Penny would look at me with those worried eyes, and I would whisper to her that it was okay, that we were safe, that the grate would hold. But I did not believe it. The sounds kept coming, metal on metal. And around 3 in the morning I heard a new noise, a groan of protest like something giving way under pressure. I gripped the knife so hard my knuckles ached. The groaning stopped. Then silence. Then nothing but the wind and the fire and my own ragged breathing for the rest of the night. Dawn came slow and gray, the storm finally dying down to scattered flurries that drifted past the windows like ash. I had not moved from the armchair in 8 hours, and my body ached in places I did not know could ache. My neck, my shoulders, the small of my back where tension had coiled like a fist. Penny had fallen asleep sometime around 5, curled into a tight ball at my feet, but I could not bring myself to close my eyes. When the first real light crept through the curtains, I forced myself to stand, joints popping, legs unsteady beneath me. I needed to see. I needed to know if what I had heard all night was real or if I had somehow imagined it, if the isolation and fear had finally cracked something loose in my mind. I pulled on my boots and my heaviest coat, grabbed the kitchen knife and stepped out onto the back porch for the first time since the storm began. The world outside was white and silent and impossibly still. The kind of stillness that makes you feel like you are the last person left alive. And then I looked down at the snow beside the house, and I knew I had not imagined anything. Footprints. Deep, heavy footprints in the fresh snow, circling the entire perimeter of the house. They started at the tree line about 50 yards out and approached in a wandering path. Like whoever made them was searching for something, testing doors and windows before moving on. I followed the trail with my eyes, my breath coming out in ragged clouds, watching it loop around the front porch, past the kitchen window where I had stood watching the storm, around the north side where the old propane tank sat buried in a drift. The prints circled the house 3 times before they finally stopped, right at the exterior cellar doors on the east side. I walked over to that spot, moving slowly, the knife clutched in my frozen fingers, The cellar doors were almost completely buried under snow, but someone had dug them out. I could see the disturbed snow, the gouges in the ice where hands had clawed at the frozen ground. The doors themselves were still closed, the iron latch still in place from what I could see. But the footprints did not lead away. They stopped at those doors and simply ended, as if whoever made them had melted into the earth or been swallowed by the basement below. I ran. I did not think, did not plan, just grabbed Penny and my car keys and plowed through the snow to my Subaru, which sat buried up to its wheel wells in the driveway. It took me 15 minutes of frantic digging with my bare hands to clear enough snow to get the door open, another 10 to rock the car free from the drift that held it. My fingers were numb and bleeding by the time I finally got the engine started, but I did not care. I drove straight to Gus Whitmore's farm, fishtailing down Hadley Road at speeds that should have put me in a ditch, and pounded on his door until he answered in his bathrobe with a shotgun in his hands. I must have looked insane, wild-eyed, shaking, blood on my hands from the ice cuts, words tumbling out of me so fast I could barely understand them myself. But Gus just listened, nodded once, and called the county sheriff on his landline while his wife Eleanor wrapped me in a blanket and pressed a mug of hot coffee into my frozen hands. The deputies arrived within the hour, 2 young men who looked barely old enough to shave, and I led them back to my property to show them what I had found. They searched the woods behind my house for 3 hours. I watched from the kitchen window, Penny pressed against my side as they trudged through the snow with their flashlights and their radios, calling out to each other in voices I could not quite hear. They found more footprints in the tree line, signs of a makeshift shelter someone had built from fallen branches about a quarter mile into the forest. They found a torn piece of orange fabric caught on a bramble, the same orange as a prison jumpsuit, but they never checked under the house. I told them about the sounds, about the security grate, about the footprints that ended at the cellar doors and never came back out. They nodded politely and said they would look into it, but I saw the way they glanced at each other, saw the look that passed between them. Just a scared woman living alone, that look said. Probably imagined half of it. They left around noon with promises to patrol the area, and I stood in my driveway watching their cruiser disappear down Hadley Road, feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my life. I did not stay in that house another night. I packed a bag, loaded Penny into the car, and drove to a motel in Burlington where I stayed for the next week, jumping at every sound, sleeping with the lights on. I called my landlord and told him I was breaking my lease, told him he could keep the deposit, told him I did not care about the money. He argued at first, threatened legal action, but when I explained what had happened, the storm, the fugitive, the sounds in the basement, his voice changed. He went quiet for a long moment, then said he would send someone to check the property. 3 days later, he called me back. His voice was different now, strained and hollow, like a man who had seen something he could not explain. They had found the security grate bent outward from the inside, 2 of the bolts sheared clean off. They had found scratches on the interior basement door, deep gouges in the old wood where someone had tried to claw their way through. And in the far corner of the basement, beneath a pile of old tarps and rotted insulation, they had found a makeshift nest, empty food cans, a filthy blanket, and a sharpened piece of metal that looked like it had been fashioned from part of the grate itself. Someone had been living down there. For how long, no one could say. Carl Eugene Vickers was captured 6 days after the storm, nearly 40 miles north of my property, suffering from severe frostbite and hypothermia. The news said he had been hiding in an abandoned hunting cabin, that he claimed he had been there the whole time since his escape. Maybe that was true. Maybe there was someone else in those woods that night. Some other desperate person who found my basement and spent hours trying to break through to where I sat, waiting with my knife. I tell myself that sometimes, when I wake up at 3 in the morning and cannot fall back asleep, I tell myself it was not him, that it was just some homeless person seeking shelter, that I was never really in danger. But I remember the way Penny growled at that vent. I remember the sound of metal scraping against metal in the darkness below my feet, and I remember those footprints in the snow, the ones that circled my house 3 times before stopping at the cellar doors and never coming back out. I live in an apartment now, 3rd floor, no basement, no attic, no crawl space. Penny still sleeps at the foot of my bed, and sometimes, late at night, I catch her staring at the heating vent near the baseboard. When she does that, I do not sleep. I just sit there in the dark, listening, waiting for a sound that I pray will never come again. Ice storms in the Pacific Northwest are rare, which is exactly why nobody was prepared when one hit our region in early 2024. My neighborhood in a small town outside Seattle basically shut down overnight. Schools closed, businesses locked up, and by the second day, the power grid had collapsed across 3 counties. At 26, still finishing up my nursing degree while working part-time at a veterinary clinic, I thought I had a decent handle on emergencies. My apartment complex sits at the end of Birchwood Lane, right next to a small cluster of older houses that have been there since the 70s. One of those houses belonged to Howard Freely, an 83-year-old widower who had lived alone since his wife passed 6 years ago. Howard and I had developed a friendly routine over the 2 years since I moved in. I would shovel his walkway in winter. He would leave bags of homegrown tomatoes on my doorstep in summer. He was sharp, funny, and always had a story about his days working as an electrician for the county. When I called his landline that Thursday morning and got no answer, I figured the phone lines were down like everything else. By noon, the temperature had dropped to 19 degrees and the ice kept coming. I bundled up in 3 layers, grabbed my flashlight and a thermos of hot coffee, and made my way across the frozen yard to Howard's place. The walk that usually took 2 minutes became a 10-minute shuffle across what felt like a skating rink. His house looked dark, obviously, like every other building on the block, but something about the stillness bothered me. No smoke from the chimney, no movement behind the frost-covered windows. I knocked on the front door and waited, my breath forming thick clouds in the frigid air. Nothing. I knocked again, harder this time, calling out his name. After what felt like forever, I heard shuffling inside. Slow, deliberate footsteps approaching the door. The deadbolt clicked, and the door opened just a crack, revealing a sliver of Howard's face illuminated by the gray daylight. His eyes, usually warm and crinkled with humor, looked different somehow. Flat, suspicious. He stared at me like he was trying to remember something important, and when he finally spoke, his voice came out thin and uncertain. "Who sent you here?" I laughed at first, thinking he was joking around the way he sometimes did. "Howard, it's me, Nate. From the apartments next door, I brought you some coffee." I held up the thermos like it was proof of my identity. He didn't move, didn't open the door any wider. His one visible eye just kept scanning my face, searching for something. The silence stretched between us, and I could feel the cold biting through my jacket. Finally, he pulled the door open enough for me to step inside, but he didn't say anything welcoming. He just shuffled backward into the dark hallway, keeping his eyes locked on me the whole time. The house was freezing, maybe 50 degrees at most, and I could see my breath even indoors. Howard was wearing a heavy wool coat over what looked like 2 sweaters, and he had a knit cap pulled down almost to his eyebrows. He looked smaller than I remembered, more fragile, like the cold had shrunk him somehow. I asked if he was okay, if he had enough food and water, and he just nodded slowly without really answering. The living room was lit by a single kerosene lantern sitting on the coffee table, casting long shadows across the walls. Old photographs lined every surface, Howard with his late wife Meredith, family gatherings from decades past, faded images of people I didn't recognize. I set the thermos down and started explaining that the power company said it could be another 2 or 3 days before they restored electricity to our area. Howard lowered himself into his recliner, the leather creaking beneath him, and watched me with that same unnerving stillness. "You're not from the apartments," he said suddenly, his voice harder now. "I know the boy from the apartments. Young kid, glasses, drives a blue truck." My heart sank a little because he was describing me. I do wear glasses, and my truck is a faded blue Ford I bought used 3 years ago. I reminded him of this gently, told him we had talked just last week about the weather forecast. He shook his head slowly, deliberately, like I was trying to trick him with an obvious lie. "No," he said. "That boy wouldn't come in here pretending to help. You people wait for storms like this. Wait for the lights to go out so nobody sees what you do." I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that Howard was 83 years old, alone, probably dehydrated, and sitting in a freezing house with no power. Confusion in elderly people can spike under stress. I had learned that much in my nursing classes. I kept my voice soft and steady, explaining that I just wanted to make sure he was safe, that I could help him get his fireplace going or bring him back to my apartment where I had a small propane heater running. Howard's jaw tightened, and he gripped the armrests of his recliner like he was bracing for something. "You stay right there," he said, pointing a bony finger at me. "Don't move." He pushed himself up from the chair with effort and disappeared down the hallway toward the back of the house. I stood there in the dim glow of the kerosene lamp, listening to his footsteps creak across the old hardwood floors. Part of me wanted to leave, just walk out the front door and call someone. But who? The roads were impassable. Cell service was barely functioning, and the nearest police station was 12 miles away through solid ice. I heard a drawer slide open somewhere in the back, then the unmistakable metallic click of something heavy being handled. Howard came back into the living room carrying a shotgun. It was an old Remington, the kind with a wooden stock worn smooth from decades of use, and he held it across his chest with both hands like he knew exactly what he was doing. My entire body went rigid. I raised my hands slowly, palms out, and took a small step backward toward the door. "Howard, please," I said, trying to keep my voice from cracking. "It's Nate. We've known each other for 2 years. You gave me tomatoes last August, remember? The big heirloom ones from your garden." He didn't lower the gun. His eyes were locked on mine, and in the flickering lantern light I could see something terrible swimming behind them. Not anger exactly, but fear. Deep, irrational, consuming fear. "I know what you're here for," he whispered. "Same thing they all want. You think because I'm old, because I'm alone, you can just walk in and take everything. But I've been ready. I've been ready for years." The barrel of the shotgun drifted slightly toward my chest, and I realized with sickening clarity that I could not simply walk out of this house. Outside, I could hear the wind picking up again, ice pellets rattling against the windows like handfuls of thrown gravel. The gray light coming through the curtains was already fading, and I knew that in another hour it would be completely dark. I thought about my options, running through them one by one in my head while trying to keep my breathing steady. If I bolted for the door, Howard might shoot. His hands looked steady enough, and at this range he wouldn't miss. If I tried to reason with him, I might just make things worse, feed into whatever delusion had taken hold of his mind. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another few degrees, and I noticed my fingers were going numb. Howard gestured with the shotgun toward the couch against the far wall. "Sit down," he ordered. "Sit down and keep your hands where I can see them." I did what he said, lowering myself onto the cold cushions slowly, never taking my eyes off the gun. He remained standing near his recliner, the weapon still trained on me, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. The kerosene lamp flickered, sending shadows dancing across his weathered face, and I tried desperately to find some trace of the Howard I knew, the man who had helped me jumpstart my truck last winter, who had told me stories about building his house with his own hands back in 1978. "Howard," I said carefully, keeping my voice as gentle as I could manage, "when did you last eat something? When did you last drink water?" He blinked at me, and for just a second I saw confusion flicker across his features. Not the paranoid suspicion, but genuine uncertainty. "I had coffee this morning," he said, though his voice wavered like he wasn't entirely sure. "Meredith made it before she left for the store." My chest tightened at that. Meredith had been dead for 6 years. I didn't correct him, Didn't want to risk triggering something worse, but now I understood what I was dealing with more clearly. Dehydration, hypothermia, isolation. Any one of those could cause cognitive decline in someone his age, but all three together could create a perfect storm of confusion and paranoia. The Howard standing in front of me with a loaded shotgun wasn't evil or dangerous by nature. He was terrified, lost in some fractured version of reality where his dead wife was still alive, and strangers were coming to rob him in the dark. But understanding that didn't make the gun any less real, didn't make my situation any less desperate. I needed to keep him talking, keep him calm, and somehow find a way to either get that weapon away from him or get myself out of this house before something irreversible happened. I decided to try a different approach. Instead of insisting on who I was, I would step into his world, try to meet him where his mind had taken him. "You're right to be careful," I said slowly, keeping my hands visible on my knees. "There are bad people out there, people who take advantage of situations like this." Howard's grip on the shotgun loosened just a fraction, and he tilted his head slightly, listening. "But I'm not one of them. I'm just a neighbor who was worried about you. Meredith would want someone checking in on you, wouldn't she?" At the mention of his wife's name, something shifted in his expression. The hardness around his eyes softened, and for a moment he looked almost lost, like a child trying to remember something important. "Meredith worries too much," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "Always telling me to be careful, to lock the doors, to keep the gun loaded." He lowered the barrel slightly, pointing it more toward the floor than at my chest. I felt a tiny spark of hope flicker in my gut. The kerosene lamp sputtered, the flame dancing wildly before settling again, and in that wavering light I saw tears forming in the corners of Howard's eyes. "She hasn't come back yet," he said, his voice cracking. "She went to the store hours ago. The roads must be bad." I swallowed hard, trying to figure out how to navigate this moment without shattering his fragile state. Part of me wanted to tell him the truth, that Meredith was gone, that she had been gone for years, that he was living in a memory that no longer existed. But I knew that could break him completely, could send him spiraling into something even more dangerous. So instead, I nodded gently and said, "The roads are really bad, Howard. She's probably waiting it out somewhere safe. She'll be back when the storm passes." He seemed to accept this, his shoulders dropping slightly as some of the tension left his body, but he didn't put the gun down. He shuffled over to the window, pulling back the frost-covered curtain with one hand while keeping the Remington clutched in the other. Outside, the world had become a solid sheet of white and gray, ice coating every surface, the sky heavy with clouds that promised more to come. "I don't like this," he whispered. "I don't like any of this." Neither did I. My phone was in my pocket, but I had checked it before coming over. 2% battery and no signal. Even if I could call for help, no one was coming through that ice. The next hour passed in a kind of surreal standoff. Howard wouldn't let me leave, but he also wouldn't put the gun down. He sat in his recliner with the Remington across his lap, watching me with that mixture of suspicion and confusion that had become his default expression. I stayed on the couch, my hands visible at all times, talking to him in slow, careful sentences about nothing in particular. The weather, the neighborhood, stories about the veterinary clinic where I worked. Sometimes he would respond, offering fragments of memories that jumped between decades without warning. One minute he was telling me about wiring a house in 1982, the next he was asking if I had seen his daughter lately. I didn't know Howard had a daughter. He had never mentioned her in the 2 years I'd known him. When I asked her name, he went quiet for a long time before whispering, "Lorraine," and something about the way he said it made me think they hadn't spoken in years. The darkness outside had become complete now, the windows nothing but black mirrors reflecting the dim glow of the kerosene lamp. The temperature inside the house had dropped into the low 40s, and I could see my breath with every exhale. I asked Howard if I could light a fire in the fireplace, and he shook his head sharply, saying that the chimney hadn't been cleaned and we would die from the smoke. Around 8 o'clock, Howard's energy seemed to collapse all at once. His eyelids grew heavy, His head began to droop, and the shotgun slipped sideways in his grip. I watched him carefully, barely breathing, waiting for the moment when I might be able to move. His chin touched his chest, and for a few seconds I thought he had fallen asleep completely. I shifted my weight forward on the couch, preparing to stand, to cross the room and gently take the weapon from his hands. But the moment I moved, his eyes snapped open with startling clarity, and the barrel swung back toward me. "Don't," he said, his voice suddenly sharp and lucid. "I know what you're doing. You're waiting for me to let my guard down." My heart hammered against my ribs as I eased back into the cushions, raising my hands again in surrender. "I'm not going anywhere, Howard, I promise." He stared at me for a long moment, that terrible fear swimming in his eyes again. And then his expression crumpled into something that looked almost like grief. "I'm so tired," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm so tired of being afraid all the time. I don't even remember what I'm supposed to be afraid of anymore." In that moment, I saw him clearly, not as a threat, but as a man whose mind was betraying him, who was trapped in a prison of confusion and terror that he couldn't escape. I made a decision then, one that could have gotten me killed but felt like the only right thing to do. I stood up slowly, keeping my movements deliberate and visible, and I walked toward him. Howard raised the shotgun, his finger hovering near the trigger, but I didn't stop. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice rising in panic. "Stay back." I kept walking, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, until I was standing right in front of him, close enough that if he pulled the trigger, there would be nothing left of me. I looked into his eyes, those confused, frightened, exhausted eyes, and I said softly, "Howard, you're cold, you're tired. You haven't eaten in a long time. I'm going to sit down next to you now and we're going to figure this out together. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm not here to take anything. I'm just your neighbor, and I'm worried about you." For a long, terrible moment, he just stared at me, the barrel of the Remington pressed against my stomach. I could feel the cold metal through my jacket. Then something in his face shifted, like a cloud passing away from the sun, and he lowered the gun. It clattered to the floor between us, and Howard began to cry, deep, racking sobs that shook his entire body. I spent the rest of that night sitting beside him in the freezing dark, feeding him crackers and water I found in his kitchen, wrapping blankets around both of us to conserve warmth. He drifted in and out of lucidity, sometimes calling me by my name, sometimes calling me names I didn't recognize, his brother maybe, or an old friend from decades past. By morning, the storm had finally broken. Pale sunlight streamed through the icy windows, and I heard the distant rumble of a plow working its way down the main road. I managed to get a weak signal on my phone and called for an ambulance. When the paramedics arrived, Howard was calm, almost peaceful, though he had no memory of holding me at gunpoint for hours. They took him to the hospital, where he was diagnosed with severe dehydration and early-stage hypothermia, both of which had triggered an acute episode of delirium on top of what doctors later confirmed was progressing dementia. His daughter Lorraine flew in from Ohio 3 days later. They had been estranged for over a decade, but the crisis brought her back. Howard moved into an assisted living facility that spring, and I visited him a few times before he passed away the following winter. He never remembered that night, never knew how close he came to killing me, or how close I came to running and leaving him alone in that frozen house. But I remember every second of it, and sometimes, when the power flickers during a storm, I still feel that cold metal pressed against my stomach, still hear his broken voice asking me who sent me there. My wife Naomi and I had hiked Crescent Peak maybe 30 times since we moved to Colorado. We knew that trail, the way you know the hallway to your bathroom at night. Every root, every boulder, every switchback where the pines opened up to show the valley below. We had done it in spring when the wildflowers exploded across the meadows, in fall when the aspens turned the mountain into a wall of gold, and yes, in winter, when the snow transformed everything into this silent cathedral of white and gray. By 2024, After 6 years of marriage and countless weekends on that mountain, we considered ourselves experienced enough to handle a February hike. The forecast showed clear skies until evening, temperatures hovering around 20 degrees, wind minimal. We packed our usual winter gear, hand warmers, extra layers, emergency blankets, granola bars, and left our car at the familiar trailhead parking lot around 9 in the morning, expecting to reach the summit by noon and be back down before 3. For the first 2 hours, everything went exactly as planned. Naomi walked ahead of me like she always did, her red jacket a bright beacon against the snow, her breath puffing out in little clouds that caught the morning light. We talked about normal things, her sister's pregnancy, the leak in our basement that we kept putting off fixing, whether we should finally get a dog now that we had the yard for it. The trail was packed down from other hikers, easy to follow, and we passed a few people coming down who nodded and mentioned the views from the top were spectacular today. I remember feeling this deep contentment, this sense that life was exactly as it should be. Naomi turned around at one point and smiled at me, her cheeks pink from the cold, and I thought about how lucky I was that she actually enjoyed these hikes instead of just tolerating them for my sake. We stopped at our usual spot, a flat rock overlooking a frozen creek, to drink some water and share a protein bar. That was around 11:15, and the sky was still perfectly blue, not a single cloud in sight. The weather changed so fast that I still have trouble believing it actually happened that way. One moment we were walking through sunshine, the next the temperature dropped like someone had opened a freezer door, and this gray wall came rolling over the ridge above us. I have seen storms move in quickly before, but nothing like this. Within maybe 10 minutes, the sky went from clear to completely overcast, and the first flurries started falling. Light at first, almost pretty, the kind of snow you see in Christmas movies. Naomi laughed and stuck out her tongue to catch a flake, and I pulled out my phone to check if there was any updated weather alert. No signal, which was normal for that elevation, but the radar from that morning had shown nothing coming our way until after midnight. We decided to skip the summit and head back down, figuring we could outpace whatever was coming. That decision probably saved my life, though it almost cost me Naomi. By the time we reached the switchback where the trail curves around a massive granite outcrop, visibility had dropped to maybe 50 feet. The snow was no longer light and pretty. It was coming down sideways, driven by a wind that seemed to cut right through every layer I was wearing. I could barely keep my eyes open against it, and the trail ahead had disappeared under a fresh blanket of white. Naomi was still in front of me, but her red jacket had faded to a dim blur, and I had to shout for her to hear me over the wind. We stopped to put on our goggles and zip everything up tight, standing close together with our backs to the gust. I remember her face when she looked at me, not scared exactly, but serious in a way I rarely saw from her. She grabbed my hand and said we needed to stay close, no more than arm's length apart, and I nodded because I knew she was right. We started walking again, slower now, trying to follow what we thought was the trail. That was our first mistake. In a whiteout, what you think is the trail is just your brain trying to make sense of nothing. I do not know exactly when we got separated. That is the part that haunts me the most, that I cannot pinpoint the moment I lost her. We were holding hands, and then at some point we were not, and I assumed she had just moved slightly ahead like she always did. I kept walking, head down against the wind, following what I thought were her footprints in the snow. But fresh snow fills footprints in seconds during a storm like that, and I was probably following nothing, just depressions in the surface, shadows, my own desperate hope. I called her name, but the wind swallowed the sound before it could travel more than a few feet. I stopped and turned in a full circle, shouting Naomi over and over, and all I saw was white in every direction. No red jacket, no movement, no response. Just this endless, swirling, suffocating white that seemed to press in from all sides. I pulled out my phone with shaking fingers. Still no signal, battery at 62%, and the cold was draining it fast. I had maybe a few hours before it died completely. The rational part of my brain told me to stay put. Every survival guide, Every article I had ever read about getting lost in the wilderness said the same thing. Do not move. Stay where you are. Let rescuers find you. But Naomi was out there somewhere, possibly walking in the wrong direction, possibly hurt, and the thought of just standing still while she disappeared into that storm was unbearable. I made a decision that I will second guess for the rest of my life. I decided to retrace my steps and find her. The problem was, I had no idea which direction my steps had come from. Everything looked identical. I picked a direction that felt right, that seemed to slope downward the way the trail should, and I started walking. Every few seconds I would stop and shout her name, listening for any response, hearing nothing but wind. I walked for what felt like 20 minutes, maybe 30, and slowly I began to realize that the terrain around me did not match anything I remembered from the trail. The trees were different, thicker, older, with branches that hung low and heavy with snow. There were no trail markers, no boot prints, no sign that any human had ever walked through here before. And then I stumbled into the clearing, and everything got worse. At first I thought I had found a road, some kind of access path that might lead me back to civilization. The ground was flat and wide, cutting through the forest in a straight line, and I felt a surge of hope so intense that I almost cried. But as I walked further, I realized it was not a road at all. It was a logging track, one of those routes they carve through the forest to drag out felled trees. And it was surrounded by destruction. Stumps poked out of the snow like rotten teeth, some fresh cut with pale wood showing, others old and gray and split by weather. Heavy machinery had churned the ground into frozen ruts and ridges that the snow only partially concealed, creating a landscape that looked almost lunar in its desolation. The tracks went off in multiple directions, branching and crossing in ways that made no sense to me. I had never seen this area on any map, never heard anyone mention logging operations on this side of the mountain. I was somewhere I was not supposed to be, somewhere that did not match the terrain I had memorized over 6 years of hiking. I tried to orient myself using what little I could see. The storm had let up slightly, not stopping but thinning enough that I could make out shapes maybe 100 feet away instead of 50. The problem was that nothing I saw gave me any useful information. Mountains rose in every direction, their peaks hidden by clouds, and they all looked the same, just white slopes vanishing into gray sky. I pulled out my phone again, desperate for even one bar of signal, but there was nothing. The battery had dropped to 41%. I thought about Naomi, about how she must be looking for me too, probably making the same mistakes I was making, wandering further and further from where we had separated. If she went back to the car and called for help, they would search the trail, the route we always took. They would not think to look over here, in this unmarked section of forest that probably did not even have a name. And even if they did search here eventually, it would not be until tomorrow at the earliest. And tonight the temperature was supposed to drop to 15 below zero. I knew the math. I knew what that meant. Hypothermia would set in within hours of sunset if I could not find shelter or find my way back. I made myself stop and think, really think, instead of just reacting. Panic was the enemy now, not just the cold. I remembered something my father told me once when I was a kid, and we got turned around during a hunting trip in Wyoming. Water flows downhill, and people build things near water. If I could find a stream or creek, I could follow it down the mountain, and eventually it would lead me somewhere. The logging operation had to have an access road, a way for trucks to get in and out, and that road would connect to a real highway eventually. I closed my eyes and listened past the wind, trying to hear anything that sounded like moving water. Nothing. The world was silent except for the hiss of snow and the creak of frozen branches. I picked the logging track that seemed to head most consistently downhill and started walking, counting my steps to keep my mind focused on something other than the growing numbness in my toes. 100 steps, 200, 300. The track curved and split, and I chose the left fork because it kept going down. 400, 500. My feet were starting to feel clumsy, like they belonged to someone else, and I had to concentrate on each step to make sure I was actually lifting them high enough to clear the snow. The light was fading by the time I found the creek. I almost missed it. Just a dark line cutting through the white, barely visible under a layer of ice and snow. But the sound of water trickling somewhere beneath the surface made me stop and look closer. It was flowing, which meant it was heading somewhere, and somewhere was better than nowhere. I turned to follow it downstream, staying close to the bank but not too close, because I knew the snow could be hiding spots where the ice was thin. The temperature was dropping fast now. I could feel it in the air, this sharp edge that had not been there an hour ago, and my breath was coming out in thick clouds that froze on my beard and the edges of my hood. I checked my phone one more time. 23%, still no signal. And I took a picture of the creek and the direction I was heading, thinking that if someone found my body, at least they would know which way I had gone. That was when it really hit me, the possibility that I might actually die out here. Not as an abstract concept, but as a real and immediate thing that could happen in the next few hours. I thought about Naomi, about whether she had made it back to the car, about whether she was warm and safe and calling for help, or whether she was out here too. Somewhere in this frozen maze, as lost and scared as I was. I followed that creek for what must have been 2 miles, though it felt like 20. The banks were uneven and thick with undergrowth buried under snow, so I had to climb over fallen logs and push through branches that grabbed at my jacket like hands trying to hold me back. The cold had moved past my feet now and was creeping up my legs, this dull ache that made every step harder than the last. I kept talking to myself, out loud, just to make sure I still could, reciting song lyrics, listing the names of everyone at my office, describing what I was going to eat when I got home. Anything to keep my brain working, to fight off the fog that I knew was the first sign of serious hypothermia. The creek widened as I went, joined by smaller tributaries, and I took that as a good sign. Bigger water meant I was getting closer to the bottom of the mountain, closer to somewhere that people might actually be. And then, just as the last gray light was starting to fade into darkness, I saw something that made me want to collapse right there in the snow. A fence. A wooden fence, old and weathered, running along the far side of the creek. Fences meant property. Property meant people. People meant survival. I crossed the creek at a narrow spot where rocks broke the surface, soaking my boots in the icy water but not caring, because nothing mattered except getting to that fence. On the other side, I found a path. Not a trail, but an actual path, worn down by feet and maybe vehicles leading away from the creek through a stand of bare aspens. I followed it with the last energy I had, my legs moving on pure stubbornness, my hands so numb I could not feel them anymore. The path curved around a hill, and then I saw lights. Yellow lights, warm and glowing, coming from a small cabin maybe 300 yards ahead. I tried to run, but my body would not cooperate, so I shuffled as fast as I could, waving my arms even though no one was outside to see me. When I reached the porch, I pounded on the door with fists I could not feel, and when an old man opened it with a shotgun in his hands and suspicion on his face, I could barely get the words out. "Lost," I said. "Wife's still out there. Please help." He looked at me for a long moment, then lowered the gun and pulled me inside, and the heat from his wood stove hit me like a wall. He wrapped me in blankets and handed me a cup of something hot. I do not even remember what it was. And he picked up a landline phone and called search and rescue, while I sat there shaking so hard I could barely hold the cup. The next few hours were a blur of voices and radio static and headlights cutting through darkness. The old man, his name was Howard, I learned later, had lived on that mountain for 40 years and knew every inch of it, including the logging tracks I had stumbled through. He told the rescue team exactly where I had come from based on my description, and they recalculated their search grid to include that area. I wanted to go with them, wanted to be out there looking for Naomi, but my core temperature was dangerously low and they would not let me leave the cabin. A paramedic stayed with me, monitoring my vitals, slowly warming me up with heated blankets and warm fluids. Every minute that passed felt like an hour. I kept thinking about the cold outside, about how the temperature had probably dropped below 0 by now, about how Naomi was smaller than me and would lose heat faster. I prayed to a God I was not sure I believed in, making promises I knew I would keep if he'd just let her be okay. Around 9:30, the radio crackled with a transmission that made everyone in the room go quiet. They had found someone. Female. Red jacket. Conscious but hypothermic. They were bringing her down. Naomi had done everything right. When she realized we had gotten separated, she had stopped moving immediately and found shelter. A shallow depression beneath a rock overhang, barely big enough for her body, but enough to block the wind. She had wrapped herself in the emergency blanket from her pack, the one with the reflective silver coating, and she had stayed there for almost 5 hours, conserving energy, trusting that I would get help and send someone back for her. The rescue team found her because of that silver blanket. One of them caught a flash of reflected light from his headlamp and investigated. She had mild frostbite on 3 of her fingers and moderate hypothermia, but she was alive. They brought her to the cabin where I was waiting, and when I saw her walk through that door, pale, exhausted, her lips still slightly blue, I held her so tight that I thought I might never let go. We did not say anything for a long time. We did not need to. Howard stood in the corner of his kitchen, watching us with this quiet expression, and later he told me that in 40 years on that mountain, he had seen a lot of people get lost, and not all of them came back. We were lucky, he said. Stupid, but lucky. I could not argue with either part of that. We still hike, Naomi and I. We went back to Crescent Peak the following summer, stood at the spot where we got separated, and tried to figure out what had gone wrong. The answer was simple and humbling. We had overestimated our experience and underestimated the mountain. The storm that hit us was later classified as a microburst, a localized weather event that formed and dissipated within a few hours, too fast and too small for the regional forecast to catch. It was bad luck, pure and simple, the kind of thing that can happen to anyone no matter how prepared they think they are. But bad luck does not excuse bad decisions, and I made plenty of those once the storm hit. I should have stayed put when I lost Naomi. I should have trusted that she would do the smart thing, which she did, and that moving around blindly would only make everything worse. Instead, I let fear override logic, and I nearly got us both killed. These days we hike with GPS beacons, satellite communicators, and a strict rule that if we ever get separated again, we both stay exactly where we are and wait. We check weather forecasts obsessively, and we tell at least 3 people our exact route before we leave. Howard passed away last year. I saw his obituary in the local paper, and I drove up to his property to pay my respects. The cabin looks smaller in daylight, ordinary, just a wooden structure on the side of a mountain. But to me it will always be the place where I came back from the dead, where a stranger with a shotgun and a landline saved my life and my marriage. I left a bottle of whiskey on his porch with a note that said thank you, though I knew no one was there to read it. Some debts you can never really repay. You just carry them with you and try to be worthy of the second chance you were given. Saturday night, December 24th of 2022, and my wife Denise had been planning our little family gathering for weeks. We had moved into our house on Birchwood Lane just 8 months earlier, a modest 2-story place in a quiet neighborhood outside of Richmond, Virginia. My parents drove up from North Carolina, and Denise's sister Maggie came with her husband Owen and their 2 kids. Counting our own daughter Sophie, who had just turned 4, we had 9 people packed into a house that suddenly felt smaller than when we bought it. By 7 in the evening, the kitchen smelled like honey-glazed ham and my mother's famous sweet potato casserole, and Sophie was running circles around the Christmas tree with her cousins, their laughter bouncing off every wall. Having graduated college in 2008 during the recession, it took me 14 years to finally own a home where I could host a holiday dinner, and that night felt like proof that all the struggle had been worth something. The first knock came around 8:30, right when we were clearing the dinner plates and my father-in-law Owen was telling one of his long-winded stories about a fishing trip gone wrong. I remember pausing mid-step, a stack of dishes in my hands, thinking maybe one of the neighbors had stopped by to wish us happy holidays. We had met a few of them during the summer, mostly older couples who kept to themselves but seemed friendly enough. Denise caught my eye from across the dining room and shrugged, and I set the dishes on the counter before heading toward the front door. Our porch light was on, casting a yellow glow through the frosted glass panel beside the door, and I could see shapes standing there, more than one person, their silhouettes dark and still against the winter night. Something about the way they stood there, not moving, not talking among themselves, made me slow my pace before I reached the handle. I opened the door about halfway, keeping my body between the gap and the warmth of the house behind me. There were 4 of them standing on my porch, 3 men and 1 woman, none of them dressed for the weather. One of the men wore a thin denim jacket over a flannel shirt, and the woman had on a hoodie with the sleeves pushed up despite the temperature being in the low 30s. They ranged in age from maybe early 20s to somewhere around 50, and not one of them looked related to the others. The oldest man, a heavy-set guy with a patchy gray beard and deep-set eyes that caught the porch light in a way that made them look almost yellow, stepped forward and smiled at me. He said they were friends of Owen, that Owen had invited them to stop by for dessert, and he apologized for showing up unannounced. I turned my head back toward the dining room and called out to Owen, asking if he was expecting anyone, and Owen appeared in the hallway behind me with a confused look on his face, shaking his head slowly. When I turned back to the group, the story had already changed. The woman, who had stringy blonde hair and a nervous habit of picking at the skin around her fingernails, said they were actually friends of Maggie from her church group. I told her to hold on and went to get Maggie, who came to the door wiping her hands on a dish towel, and she stared at the 4 strangers with absolutely no recognition in her eyes. Maggie said she had never seen any of them before in her life, and that she did not belong to any church group. The youngest of the men, a skinny kid with acne scars and a shaved head, laughed awkwardly and said there must have been some kind of mix-up. Maybe they had the wrong house. But he did not move to leave, and neither did any of the others. They just stood there on my porch, breath fogging in the cold air, watching us with expressions that held something patient and calculating behind the surface politeness. The heavy-set man asked if they could at least come inside to warm up for a minute while they figured out where they were meant to be, and every instinct in my body screamed at me to say no. I told them I was sorry, but we were having a private family dinner, and that I could not let strangers into my home. The words came out firmer than I expected, and I saw something flicker behind the heavy-set man's eyes, a brief tightening around his mouth that disappeared as quickly as it came. He nodded slowly, almost theatrically, and said he understood completely, no hard feelings. Then he turned to the others and made a small gesture with his hand, just a slight movement of his fingers, and without another word the group stepped off my porch and began walking across the front yard. I watched them through the frosted glass as they reached the sidewalk, expecting them to head toward a car parked on the street, but instead they split up. The woman and the young guy with the shaved head went left, disappearing around the corner of my neighbor's fence, while the heavy-set man and the 4th member of the group, a wiry man in his 40s who had not spoken a single word the entire time, went right and vanished into the shadows between the streetlights. I closed the door and locked it, then stood there for a moment trying to convince myself that everything was fine. Owen asked what that was all about, and I told him I had no idea. Probably just some confused people who got the wrong address. But even as I said it, I did not believe it. There was something rehearsed about the way they had approached us, something coordinated about the way they had scattered when I refused them entry. Denise appeared at my side and asked if everything was okay, and I forced a smile and told her it was nothing. My father was helping the kids build a tower out of empty wrapping paper tubes in the living room, and my mother was slicing pie in the kitchen, and for a few minutes I let myself get pulled back into the warmth and noise of the holiday. I checked the front door lock twice without really thinking about it, and then I went to help my mother carry dessert plates to the dining room table. That was when I heard the handle of the back door rattle, a slow, deliberate sound that cut through the laughter, like a knife through paper. I set the plates down so hard that one of them cracked against the table, and I moved toward the kitchen without saying a word. The back door had a window in the upper half, covered by a thin curtain that Denise had hung when we moved in. and through the fabric I could see a shape standing just outside. Whoever it was did not knock, did not call out, just stood there working the handle back and forth as if testing whether the lock would hold. I reached the door and yanked the curtain aside, and found myself staring directly into the face of the woman with the stringy blonde hair. She was standing so close to the glass that her breath left a circle of fog on the surface, and when our eyes met, she did not step back or look surprised. She just smiled, a wide, empty smile that showed too many teeth, and then she let go of the handle and took one step backward into the darkness of my yard. I could hear Owen behind me now, asking what was going on, and I heard Denise telling the kids to stay in the living room in a voice that was trying very hard to sound calm. I grabbed my phone from the kitchen counter and dialed 911, my fingers moving faster than my thoughts. The dispatcher answered and I told her there were people surrounding my house, that they had tried to get in through the front door and were now trying the back, and that I had my entire family inside, including 3 small children. She asked for my address and I gave it to her, and she told me units were being dispatched and to stay on the line. Owen had gone to check the windows in the dining room, and he came back saying he could see someone moving along the side of the house, staying close to the wall where the shadows were deepest. My father appeared in the kitchen doorway holding a carving knife from the dinner table, his face pale but his jaw set in a hard line, and he asked me how many of them there were. I told him 4, at least 4, and he nodded once and positioned himself near the back door. The dispatcher was asking me questions I could barely process, and somewhere in the living room I heard Sophie asking her mother why everyone looked so scared. The next few minutes stretched out into something that felt like hours. We gathered everyone into the living room, away from the windows, and Denise sat on the floor with the 3 kids, reading them a story from one of Sophie's new Christmas books, in a voice that barely trembled. My mother sat beside them, her hand resting on my daughter's back, and I could see her lips moving in what I think was a silent prayer. Owen and my father and I took positions where we could watch the doors and the main windows, and Maggie stood near the hallway with her phone out, recording video of the front yard through a gap in the curtains. The dispatcher stayed on the line, her voice a steady anchor in the chaos, telling me the officers were 7 minutes out, then 5, then 3. I kept expecting to hear glass breaking, kept expecting one of those strangers to come crashing through a window, but instead there was only silence from outside, a thick, oppressive silence that was almost worse than noise would have been. They were still out there, I knew they were, circling the house like wolves waiting for a gap in the fence. At 9:14, I saw the flash of red and blue lights painting the walls of my living room, and I have never felt relief like that in my entire life. 2 patrol cars pulled up to the curb, and I watched through the window as 4 officers got out with flashlights already in their hands. I told the dispatcher they had arrived, and she said I could hang up, and I went to the front door and opened it to meet the first officer on the porch. He was a tall man with a shaved head and a calm demeanor, and he asked me to describe what had happened, while his partner began walking the perimeter of the house with his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. I told him everything: the knock, the changing stories, the way they had scattered, the woman at the back door, and he listened without interrupting, just nodding occasionally and taking notes. His partner came back around the corner of the house and said there was no one in the yard, no one in the back, no sign of forced entry on any of the doors or windows. They checked the side gate, the garage, even looked behind the shed where I kept the lawn equipment, and found nothing but footprints in the frost-covered grass, at least 4 distinct sets leading from the back door toward the fence line and then disappearing into the neighbor's property. The officers took statements from all of us, and Maggie showed them the video she had recorded, though it was too dark to make out much more than shapes moving in the yard. One of the officers, a woman with short gray hair who had been canvassing the street, came back and told us that a neighbor 3 houses down had seen a white van parked at the end of the block earlier that evening, one she did not recognize from the neighborhood. The van had been there when she took her dog out around 7, and it was gone by the time the patrol cars arrived. The officers exchanged a look that I did not like, a look that told me this was not the first time they had heard about something like this. One of them mentioned that there had been a string of home invasions in the county over the past few months, all targeting houses during family gatherings when the occupants would be distracted and the doors might be unlocked. He said we were lucky, that the fact we had not let them in and had called quickly was probably what saved us. He did not say what had happened to the families who had not been so careful, and I did not ask. We filed a police report, and the officers gave us a case number, and they promised to increase patrols in the area for the next few weeks. After they left, nobody felt much like celebrating anymore. My parents decided to stay the night instead of driving back, and Owen and Maggie put their kids to bed in Sophie's room, while the adults sat in the living room with the lights on and the doors double-checked. I do not think any of us slept more than an hour or two that night. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the windows, sent my heart racing all over again. I kept seeing that woman's face pressed close to the glass, that smile that held nothing behind it but patience and intent. The police never found them, never identified them, never made an arrest. About a month later, I read in the local paper that a family in Henrico County had been robbed at gunpoint on New Year's Day. 4 intruders who had talked their way inside by claiming to be lost and asking to use the phone. I stared at that article for a long time, wondering if it was the same people, wondering what would have happened if I had opened that door just a little wider. The winter I took that night shift at the little 24-hour convenience store felt like something I agreed to, out of stubbornness more than necessity. At the time, I was juggling community college classes during the day and trying to save enough money to move out of the apartment I shared with my cousin. Night shifts were quiet, predictable, and honestly a break from the chaos of everything else. That particular night, the cold outside didn't feel real until you stepped near the front windows, ice crusted along the edges, like the glass was slowly shrinking. I remember pacing the aisles around 1 a.m., organizing things that didn't need to be organized, just trying to stay awake while the heater rattled in that uneven way it always did during the deep freezes. Closing hours didn't technically apply to us, but our manager insisted we lock the doors between 2 and 3 a.m. so we could restock safely. I hated that hour. Customers could see the lights on and still come up to the door, and I'd have to mime closed through the glass like an idiot. That night, I had just finished taking out a trash bag when I heard sharp tapping on the front window. Not loud, more like hurried, uneven knocks. A man stood there, wrapped in a thin hoodie so soaked with frost it looked stiff. His hair was plastered to his forehead, and his face carried this pinched expression, like the cold had peeled away everything except desperation. He mouthed something, then knocked again, faster. I walked up to the door, holding my arms tight across my chest because the cold seeped through the frame. Before I could say anything, he pressed his palm flat against the glass and blurted out, "Please, can you just let me in for a minute, just to warm up? I just need a minute." His voice had that trembling edge that made me instinctively want to help, but rules were rules, and we'd been warned repeatedly not to open the doors under any circumstances. I shook my head gently, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained through the crack in the auxiliary speaker that I couldn't unlock it. His expression shifted, not anger exactly, but this tightening around his jaw, like my refusal had knocked something loose inside him. I stepped back a little, expecting him to leave, but instead his gaze shifted past me, towards something behind my shoulder. When I turned slightly, I noticed another figure outside, a second man standing several feet behind him in the snow. He wore a dark coat and kept both hands in his pockets. No visible tension, no shivering, no attempt to get closer. He just stood there, unmoving, his face shadowed by the store's overhang. The first man looked from him to me, then leaned in again, knocking harder now, each strike echoing through the empty store. I backed away farther, and as soon as I did, the two of them peeled off in opposite directions like they had choreographed it, heading toward the side doors and testing every handle they could find. They moved with this unsettling coordination, never speaking to each other, never calling out, just checking door after door like they already knew the layout. I hurried behind the counter and hit the security lock button, even though I wasn't sure it did anything beyond making me feel less exposed. Through the side window, I saw the first man tugging at the metal handle so aggressively that the whole frame vibrated. The other one walked slower, dragging his boots through the snow in a careful line, almost like he was tracing a path he'd followed before. The store felt smaller with each of their attempts. Every sound echoed. Each rattle of a door, each scrape against the siding. I tried calling our overnight manager, but the call went straight to voicemail, and the silence in my ear after the beep made my throat tighten. I crouched low behind the counter, peeking through the bottom portion of the glass, hoping they'd give up. Instead, I heard the crunch of snow near the back delivery area. One of them had gone around the building, maybe both. I couldn't see anything from that angle, only the faint blue headlights from a car parked at the far end of the lot. Its trunk was wide open, the interior light flickering every few seconds, as if the bulb was dying. I hadn't noticed the car earlier, which was strange because the lot was usually empty at that hour. The open trunk made me nauseous in a way I couldn't rationalize, like I was staring at a problem with an answer I didn't want to know. When I finally stood up enough to look through the front window again, the first man reappeared. This time much closer to the glass than before. His breath fogged the surface in uneven bursts. He wasn't knocking now. He was staring directly into the store, scanning every aisle behind me as if counting the steps it would take to get to each one. Before I could duck again, he tried the door one more time, gripping it so tightly his knuckles went pale. Then he stepped aside without warning, and the second man came into view from the opposite direction. They exchanged a look. Not quite communication, more like they were confirming something silently, and then both walked briskly toward the back of the building again. I grabbed the store phone and called 911, whispering because my voice felt too loud in the empty aisles. The dispatcher kept asking for details, but all I could do was describe the two men circling the building and the open trunk in the lot. While I was on the call, a sharp metallic clang hit the back door, followed by another and another. Steady, deliberate strikes. I told the dispatcher about it, and she said an officer was already en route, but the closest one was several minutes away. I remember pressing my hand against the underside of the counter to stop myself from pacing, trying to decide whether to hide in the storage room or stay where the security cameras could see me. Before I made up my mind, the clanging stopped, replaced by a long swiping sound, like someone dragging something heavy across the ice near the back entrance. The dragging sound moved slowly along the rear wall of the store, pausing every few seconds before continuing, as if they were positioning something or testing angles. I stayed crouched, barely breathing, trying to listen through the hum of the outdated freezer unit behind me. Then, without warning, the security lights on the side of the building flickered on, casting a sharp white glow across the snow. In that brief illumination, I saw both men standing near the corner of the lot, not at the door anymore, but beside their car. The first man paced in a tight circle, rubbing his sleeves like he was warming up for something, while the second stood motionless beside the open trunk. Whatever they were doing, it felt deliberate, like there was a sequence to their actions that I wasn't meant to understand. The harsh lights clicked off again, plunging everything back into that bluish winter darkness. I ducked out of sight, terrified they'd seen me watching. A few seconds later, I heard a new sound, the slow crunch of footsteps approaching the front door once more. But only one set this time. I risked lifting my head just above the counter, and there he was, the first man leaning close to the glass, his breath spreading across it in frantic patterns. His face looked different now, almost eager, as if he believed something had changed. He cupped his hands around his eyes and scanned the store with this unsettling patience, neither knocking nor speaking. Just waiting. Before I could pull back again, headlights swept across the parking lot, cutting through the frost-coated windows. A patrol car rolled in, tires crunching through the hard-packed ice. At the sight of it, the man at the door whipped his head toward the lot, then sprinted toward the car with the open trunk. The second man slammed the trunk shut with a violent thud, and the two of them jumped inside their vehicle before the officer even had time to step out. Their engine revved hard, fishtailing as they tore out of the lot and disappeared down the road, spraying snow everywhere in their rush to get away. The patrol car tried to follow but lost traction, giving them several seconds of advantage, more than enough for them to vanish into the dark. The officer eventually came inside to check the building, making sure no doors had been tampered with. He walked around with me, shining his flashlight along the back wall and the frozen pavement, but whatever they had dragged or moved left no clear marks, just smeared patches in the snow where the ground looked disturbed. The open trunk, the way they circled the store, their silent coordination, none of it added up. The officer stayed until sunrise, but the men never came back, and their car was never identified from the description I gave. Even now, I still wonder what would have happened if I had unlocked that door. If the story would have ended inside that trunk instead of behind a counter, waiting for help that barely arrived in time. The evening had turned into one of those stubborn winter storms that seemed to appear out of nowhere, even though the forecast had only hinted at flurries. I was heading back from a small consulting job in a quiet town a couple of hours from where I live, cutting through a stretch of rural road that barely saw traffic on normal days. My routine back then was pretty simple. Take whatever freelance work came my way, drive long distances, and try to get home before the weather decided to test my patience. That night, the snow was falling so thick it looked like static on a broken TV screen, and the wind kept pushing my car just enough to make me grip the wheel harder. By the time I reached a narrow part of the road where the trees leaned in so close they felt like a tunnel, my tires slid over a sheet of ice I hadn't seen. The car swerved, dragged sideways, and ended up lodged against a sloped patch of frozen dirt. The engine was still running, but the wheels spun uselessly. I remember sitting there for a moment, listening to the rhythmic thump of branches hitting the roof, trying to decide if I should call for help or wait it out. My phone signal flickered between one bar and none, and the cold had already started seeping in through the gaps around the doors. The storm made everything strangely silent, like the world outside was wrapped in cotton. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, hoping another car might appear, though I hadn't seen headlights for nearly half an hour. That road wasn't the kind people chose unless they lived nearby or had no other option. I told myself I'd try rocking the car free one more time before giving up, but the wheels just spun, spraying snow behind me. A knot of frustration built in my chest, mixed with the uncomfortable realization that I was more alone out there than I'd expected. That's why the sudden glow of headlights behind me felt like a miracle. They rounded the bend slowly, the beams cutting through the thick curtain of snow until a pickup truck rolled into view. Its engine rumbled louder than I anticipated, and it stopped a little closer to my bumper than people usually do in weather like that. For a moment, all I felt was relief. I kept thinking, finally someone else is on this road, someone who might have a tow strap or at least a phone signal strong enough to call a real tow truck. Before I could even get out of my car, two men stepped out of the pickup, their silhouettes outlined by the headlights. Both wore reflective vests, the kind road crews or volunteers might use. One of them waved at me with quick, assertive motions, like he'd done this dozens of times. The sight made my tension ease just a bit, enough that I opened my door and leaned out to talk to them. The first man approached with a steady gait, his boots crunching through the snow in a slow, heavy rhythm. Up close, he looked to be in his late 30s, clean-shaven with a square jaw, and a voice that carried easily over the wind. He told me they were volunteer responders who patrolled the rural roads during storms, helping out anyone stranded. His partner hung back at first, standing near the tailgate of the truck with his hands tucked inside his vest. Something about their coordination felt rehearsed, but not in a professional way, more like two people trying to imitate a role they'd studied, but never actually performed. My eyes drifted to their vests, and that's when the first poke of unease reached me. The patterns didn't match. One had bright orange stripes running horizontally, while the other had narrow diagonal ones in dull yellow. They weren't part of any group I'd ever seen, and the pickup behind them had absolutely no markings, not even a magnet decal. My relief thinned out fast. The man closest to me leaned in slightly, lowering his voice as if we were sharing a secret no one else should hear. He said the cold could mess with a person fast in storms like this, and that I should get into their truck to warm up while they figured out how to free my car. His tone had that forced calm people use when trying to steer someone toward a choice without making it sound like pressure. I told him I was fine staying where I was, that the heater still worked. His expression barely shifted, but something in his posture tightened, like he wasn't expecting me to decline. Behind him, his partner began pacing slowly toward the back of my car, each step measured and deliberate. I couldn't see his face clearly, only the dim reflection of my brake lights glinting off the wet fabric of his vest. But he moved with purpose. Too much purpose for someone just trying to help. I kept one foot outside the car, the other still inside, torn between politeness and that rising internal alarm people get when they sense a situation changing shape. Snowflakes were landing on the first man's eyelashes, sticking there as he spoke again, this time insisting that their truck had better heat than mine. He added that it wasn't safe for me to stay alone, not in weather like this. Something about the way he phrased it made the hairs on my arms lift. I glanced past him toward their vehicle, expecting to see some sort of equipment, shovels, chains, emergency lights. But the bed was empty. No salt bags, no tow straps. Just an old blue cooler and a single tarp that looked brand new compared to the rest of the truck. That contrast bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Then the first man slipped his hand into his jacket, slowly, like he was reaching for something he wanted to have ready but didn't want me to notice. The motion was subtle, almost casual, but the intention behind it felt incredibly wrong. My breath caught in my chest as every instinct I had screamed to pay attention. At the same time, the other man had moved farther behind my car, his boots disappearing from my side mirror as he positioned himself directly behind the trunk, completely blocking any shot of me reversing out. I hadn't even realized how boxed in I'd become until that moment. The storm continued to batter everything around us, muting sounds and making the world feel smaller, tighter, like the three of us were trapped inside a snow globe. Trying to keep my voice steady, I told them I just needed a push, not a ride, and that someone else was already on the way, which wasn't true, but I needed something to shift the mood. The man closest to me pulled his hand back out of his jacket, not empty but still obscured by his sleeve, and he stepped a little closer, narrowing the space between us. His partner tapped the back of my car twice, hard enough to jolt it slightly, like he wanted me to know exactly where he was. The uneasiness had grown into something sharper, something that pressed against my ribs from the inside. Every bit of warmth from my heater suddenly felt useless. It was clear now. They weren't there to help me, and whatever they had planned wasn't going to involve me driving away easily. With both men closing in on me from different angles, I realized staying half inside the car was a mistake. I pulled my leg back in fully and shut the door, not slamming it, but firm enough that they'd hear it through the wind. The first man immediately tried the handle, giving it a quick tug like he assumed it would still be unlocked. When it didn't budge, he leaned toward the window and told me I was making things harder than they needed to be. His voice dropped low enough that the words felt directed at me alone, not meant for the storm or his partner. I didn't reply. I just reached down and hit the button that locked all the doors at once. The sound was small, barely audible over the weather, but the shift it caused in his expression was unmistakable. He no longer pretended to be helpful. I put the car in gear, even though I knew the wheels would just spin. The engine whined as the tires tried and failed to grip the ice. The man behind my car stepped closer, bracing both hands against the trunk as if daring me to try again. Their headlights cast their shadows long and warped across the snow, stretching them like figures in a fever dream. I kept my eyes forward, searching for any patch of ground that looked even remotely solid enough to catch traction. Meanwhile, the first man rapped his knuckles against the window, not angrily but rhythmically, like he was waiting for me to brake before he did. The whole situation had collapsed from minor roadside incident into something predatory, fast enough to make my thoughts scatter. A gust of wind hit the trees above us, breaking loose a sheet of snow that crashed down onto the hood of my car. The sound startled both men just enough to give me a second of breathing room. I took advantage of it, gently rocking the car back and forth in the narrow space it had. At first, nothing changed. Then the back right tire nudged against a patch of rougher ice, still slippery, but textured enough to feel different under the wheels. I eased onto the gas the moment I felt it. The car jerked sideways, almost stalling out, but the movement forced the man behind me to step back or risk getting clipped. He shouted something I couldn't make out, but his voice had lost its calm veneer. That alone was enough to push me to try again. The second attempt worked better than I could have hoped. The tire caught just enough traction to pull the car free from the slope, lurching it forward several feet. I didn't stop to think or look back. I kept accelerating, letting the car fishtail along the road until it straightened itself out. In the mirror, the men were silhouettes swallowed by the storm, their truck still parked, headlights glaring through the snow like twin angry eyes. They didn't try to follow me, at least not that I ever saw. I drove until the storm thinned and the first cluster of distant porch lights came into view, and only then did I pull over to breathe again. I never filed a report because I had no names, no plates, nothing concrete. But whenever winter returns and I find myself on a lonely road, I think about those mismatched vests and the way they moved with such quiet intention. Whatever they wanted that night, I'm certain it wasn't to help. Snow trips weren't really my thing back then, but that winter I was trying hard to get out of a rut. So when my friend Jordan suggested a quick day hike on a popular trail near his town, I went along without thinking too much. Life was quiet for me in those days, working remote, barely talking to neighbors, spending most weekends trying to pretend I wasn't feeling stuck. The trail was considered safe and well marked, a place families visited for photos whenever fresh snow fell. That morning the sky had that chalky gray look that makes the whole landscape feel flat, and Jordan kept joking about how it felt like we were walking through an old postcard. I remember noticing how the cold made every sound snap sharply, like twigs breaking much closer than they really were. Nothing seemed strange at first. We were just two friends trying to shake off the winter blues. The hike turned eerie faster than either of us expected. About an hour in, a scream sliced through the trees, high, raw, and panicked, the kind that makes you instinctively lock your jaw. Jordan stopped mid-sentence, staring at me like he wasn't sure if I'd heard the same thing. The sound didn't resemble any animal I knew, and the woods around us went unusually still right after, as if the whole place was listening. We followed the trail a little farther, half expecting another hiker to run past us asking for help. But no one appeared, and the silence kept stretching in this heavy, unnatural way. I remember tugging my scarf up to my chin, not because of the cold, but because the air suddenly felt too open. Curiosity eventually pushed us off the trail. The snow was fresh enough that anything moving through the area would have left tracks, and we figured we'd at least find signs of some animal in distress. Instead, we found a single line of human boot prints, deep, sharp impressions that veered into a narrow pocket of trees where branches formed a kind of crooked arch overhead. No paw prints, no drag marks, nothing suggesting wildlife. Jordan tried to call out, his voice echoing strangely like it was bouncing off something farther away. The boot prints looked recent, maybe minutes old, and something about how they were spaced made my chest tighten. They were steady, deliberate, not the footsteps of someone running in fear. We followed them only a short distance before spotting him. A man stood between the trees about 50 yards ahead, wearing a dark coat dusted with snow, his posture rigid as if he'd been waiting for us to notice. He didn't wave, didn't speak, didn't even shift his weight. He just stared in our direction with an intensity that made the cold feel sharper. Jordan tried calling out again, but the man didn't react. He simply turned and walked deeper into the woods, leaving that same neat trail of prints. Something in the way he moved, slow, unhurried, almost guiding, made me uneasy, but Jordan insisted we shouldn't assume anything bad. Still, When the man reappeared a second time, standing even farther out but in the same rigid pose, I remember feeling a creeping realization that he was leading us somewhere, not trying to escape us. Snow kept drifting down in soft, uneven sheets as we moved deeper into the trees, following the boot prints without speaking much. The official trail had vanished behind us, swallowed by the cold air and the dense branches overhead, but neither of us wanted to admit how turned around we were. Each time we paused, a faint sound would carry through the woods, sometimes a short, clipped cry, other times something that mimicked a distant gasp. It felt like whoever was making those noises was always just out of sight, shifting positions the moment we tried to pinpoint them. Jordan kept glancing back, like he expected the man to appear behind us again, but the only thing visible was this dull, washed-out landscape smudged with gray light. We spotted the man for the third time near an old, half-fallen pine. His coat looked heavier now, weighed down by accumulated snow, and he stood at a strange angle, as though his feet were planted, but his upper body leaned slightly forward. What unsettled me most was how perfectly still he held himself. No visible breath, no twitch of his shoulders, no adjustment for warmth. As soon as he saw that we were looking, he stepped away into a narrow valley between two ridges. It wasn't a normal walking motion. It was too smooth, almost practiced, like someone retracing steps they'd taken too many times. Jordan muttered that maybe he was injured or confused, but I kept focusing on the fact that he never once tried to signal for help. The screams came again, sharper and closer than before. This time they ricocheted between the trees in a way that felt intentional, like they were being projected from different points. I remember stopping so abruptly that the cold bit through the back of my knees. We listened, really listened, and realized the echoes weren't random. They circled us. Jordan whispered that we should go back the way we came, but the snow had already filled in most of our footprints, and every direction felt identical. The only path still clear was the one the man had made. For a moment, I felt this childish urge to call out and demand whoever was screaming to speak clearly, to say something human, something grounding. But my throat tightened each time I tried. We followed the valley the man had taken, mostly because it was the only choice that didn't feel like pure guesswork. The air there felt heavier, muffled in a way I'd never experienced outdoors. The trees grew close enough that their branches curved overhead like ribs, and the snow beneath them looked untouched, except for the prints we kept trailing behind. Then Jordan grabbed my sleeve and pointed. There he was again, standing perfectly still in the center of a small clearing, waiting. He lifted one arm, not waving, not beckoning, just raising it slightly as though marking a direction. And as we watched, the surrounding woods let out one long, dragging scream that didn't sound like any living creature I could place. It felt rehearsed, almost mechanical, and it came from everywhere at once. The man lowered his arm and turned away again, slipping between a cluster of trees so densely packed, they looked like they were stitched together. Jordan wanted to yell at him, to demand he stop and explain what he wanted, but the scream that followed cut him off. It came from just behind us, even though there was no one there. I spun around so fast my boots slid on the ice, and the only thing I saw was a thin trail of snow falling from a branch, as if something had brushed past it seconds before. The silence that followed wasn't natural. It pressed in around us, thick and waiting, like the woods were holding their breath for our next move. Jordan leaned close and said we shouldn't follow the man anymore, that we needed to pick a direction and commit to it, even if we weren't sure. But the truth was that any direction besides his felt like stepping blindfolded into a void. We walked quickly, choosing a path that angled slightly uphill, hoping it would lead us back toward the main ridge. For a few minutes the forest seemed calmer, the sounds settling into their normal winter hush. Then the boot prints appeared again, not ours, but his, cutting across our path at a perfect right angle, as if he'd predicted exactly where we'd try to go. They were fresh, impossibly fresh. Jordan stopped walking altogether, staring at them like they'd sprouted out of the snow. I remember whispering his name and feeling this strange heat rise in my chest, the kind that comes from being watched. We didn't see the man right away, but I knew he was close. The air around us shifted in a subtle way, like something large had just changed position without making a sound. Jordan spotted him first. The man stood halfway up the hill, facing us this time. His coat hung strangely on his frame, stretched in places where it shouldn't be, and the snow around him looked disturbed even though he stood perfectly still. The worst part was his head. It was tilted at an angle that made my neck ache just looking at it, as though he was listening for something behind us rather than watching us directly. Jordan whispered that we should go around him, skirt the hill and head toward the open clearing he pointed out earlier on our map. But when we moved sideways, the man shifted instantly, mirroring our angle without taking a step. It didn't make sense. 1 second he was yards away. The next he was aligned with us perfectly again. Like the distance between us had folded. We bolted, not elegantly, not bravely, just pure instinct. Branches snagged our sleeves, snow kicked up behind us, and my lungs burned from the cold. The woods blurred into streaks of white and brown, and for a moment I didn't even care which direction we were going as long as it was away from him. When we finally stumbled into a clearing, an area with a faded wooden trail marker half buried in snow, I nearly collapsed from relief. Civilization had to be close. Behind us, the woods settled into an unnatural quiet. No screams, no footsteps, no figure watching from between the trees. It was as if the entire forest had shut its eyes. Jordan and I didn't talk much on the way back to the parking lot. We kept expecting to hear another cry or see that man standing somewhere behind us, but the woods stayed silent the entire hike out. When we reached the trailhead, a pair of rangers were checking the posted conditions. They asked if we'd gone off trail because they'd found sets of boot prints leading into areas no one should be wandering this time of year. We told them everything, every scream, every appearance of the man, and one ranger's face tightened in a way he tried to hide. He said people got turned around easily in winter. That sound behaves strangely in the cold, and that sometimes you convince yourself you're being followed when you're not. But then he added quietly that if we ever heard screaming in that forest again, we should leave immediately. No investigation, no heroics, just leave. We never found out who the man was or why his boot prints kept crossing ours in places we knew we'd never walked. But I haven't been back to that trail since, and Jordan refuses to even drive near the area. Whatever was out there that day didn't want help. It wanted us deeper in those woods. And if we hadn't run when we did, I'm not sure either of us would have found our way back out.